What if I told you the most powerful men in American history were also, somehow, the weirdest? Presidents who talked to shadows, feared tomatoes, named their boots, and nearly started wars over salad forks. This isn't the sanitized myth of marble men. This is what happens when unchecked power meets unfiltered personality. From haunted wigs to swearing parrots, we're opening the Oval Office's most deranged drawer. Welcome to the most bizarre facts about the US presidents, where history gets truly and gloriously unhinged. George Washington. He was not yet the father of a nation when he first felt it, the need to control the passage of time. The boy who once copied down 110 etiquette rules by hand, word for word, was not being punished. He was preparing for what exactly no one could yet say, but every inked commandment. Sleep not when others speak. Speak not evil of the absent, carved a groove in his mind that would harden with age into something cold and deliberate. Even then, young George Washington was learning that identity was not inherited, it was manufactured. At 6 feet 2 inches, Washington towered over his peers in both stature and silence. He didn't speak unless he had rehearsed. He didn't laugh without weighing its implication. And he didn't, under any circumstances, allow a minute of his day to go unaccounted for. Punctuality to him wasn't courtesy. It was discipline. It was a wall between the man and the chaos outside him. And if someone showed up 3 minutes late, that wall cracked just slightly. He was known to grow visibly irritated, his jaw locking tight, his lips pressing into a white line. And yet, there were glimpses of something more tender beneath the rigid geometry of his self-control, like his dogs. One of them named Drunkard, another Vulcan, and one, inexplicably, Sweet Lips. He kept them close, not as political accessories, but as strange companions in a world that required him to always be more symbol than man. Even in portraits, Washington rarely smiled. His face was a mask of deliberate solemnity, but those who knew him spoke of the affection he showed his hounds, the softness in his voice as he whispered names that would never make it into the biographies. Then there was the matter of the owls. In the final years of his life, when illness and age began their slow encroachment, Washington developed a particular fear. He believed that the hoot of an owl outside his window foretold death, not just symbolically, but literally. In the 18th century, this wasn't so strange. Superstition ran like blood through the veins of both rich and poor. But for a man who had once stood untouched through cannon fire, whose coat had been pierced by bullets, while he remained unharmed, the fear seemed almost poetic. Nature had spared him 1,000 times. Now it sent a bird to whisper the bill was due. He instructed that when he died, his body was not to be buried for 3 full days. He feared being entombed alive, an understandable fear in an age without reliable signs of death. But deeper down, it might have been something else. Not just a dread of premature burial, but a stubborn clinging to control. Even in death, he needed a schedule. He died not with fanfare, but with an apology. His last words were simple, "'Tis well," as though he were giving permission for the curtain to close. The public, of course, mourned him as a titan, the American Cincinnatus, the man who relinquished power not once, but twice. His funeral was conducted with military precision. Statues followed. Myths grew. Cherry trees and silver dollars entered the bloodstream of schoolchildren's stories. But the real Washington, the man who bowed instead of shaking hands, who avoided public speaking, who named his horse Nelson and whispered to his dogs, remained mostly hidden behind the polished marble of national memory. He had built his image with the same care he once used to arrange his dining table, and perhaps that was the point. Behind every performance of strength, there is the shadow of something softer, quieter, more human. It's easy to call him a stoic, a general, a president, but maybe it's more honest to say this. George Washington was a man who built his entire life to hold the world at arm's length. He scheduled every moment, named every creature, feared every owl, and prayed, perhaps, that no one would ever see the man behind the monument. Of course, they didn't. Not really. They rarely do. But what they did see, what they were never allowed to forget, was that the president was never late. Not once. Not ever. And when the clocks finally stopped for him, they ticked louder for everyone else. Ticking louder still, in fact, for the man who followed. He was shorter, sharper, and infinitely more agitated. Where Washington moved in silence, he muttered to himself, counted the people who respected him, and once argued that onions cured colds. Not a general, not a king, but a man so precise. He corrected people's calendars and tallied moral slights like unpaid debts. His name was John Adams, and if George Washington was the myth, Adams was the reality biting back. John Adams. He called himself obnoxious and disliked, and the world, to his great frustration, rarely disagreed. John Adams was not a man you could easily romanticize. He lacked the serene grandeur of Washington, the poetic mystique of Jefferson. He had no towering frame or gallant silence to hide behind. What he did have was a tankard of hard cider, a library of political grudges, and a mind that rarely stopped spinning itself into either clarity or chaos. His brilliance was volcanic, raw, forceful, and prone to eruption at the worst possible moments. Each morning, Adams started his day with hard cider, not as a luxury or an indulgence, but as a ritual. A tankard, not a glass, cold, bitter, acidic. It burned a path through his throat that matched the one he carved through early American politics, bracing and divisive. In his letters, he described the drink as a tonic for clarity, a way to jumpstart the day's moral calculus. His enemies, of course, saw it differently, but then Adams rarely gave them a reason not to. He was a political philosopher who distrusted the masses, a revolutionary who feared democracy, a patriot who despised Philadelphia. The contradictions were not hidden. They were inscribed in every page of his feverish correspondence. No one wrote like John Adams. He wrote compulsively, incessantly, thunderously. He once penned 113 letters in a single month, as if sheer documentation could prove he had been right all along. In that flurry of ink, one insult stood out. Aimed squarely at his nemesis, Alexander Hamilton, he called him a bastard brat of a Scotch peddler. It was a line of surgical meanness, designed not just to wound, but to echo. Adams didn't need to shout. His pen did the shouting for him. And then there was the parrot. Abigail Adams, his wife and intellectual equal, once kept a pet parrot that had a curious vocabulary. It swore, often loudly, and to the great amusement of guests. Rumors swirled that the bird had picked up its choice language from none other than John himself. Whether or not that's true hardly matters. The image stuck, a founding father pacing his study, muttering obscenities in colonial Massachusetts, while a parrot in the next room mimicked his outraged syllable, four-syllable. What makes John Adams fascinating is not his presidency, which was marked by diplomatic skirmishes and internal brawls, nor is it his legacy, which he feared might evaporate in Washington's shadow. It's the obsessive, neurotic, often petty humanity that runs through everything he touched. He took slights personally. He monitored his respect levels like rainfall. He chewed raw onions to prevent illness and believed horses could detect liars. One mare, he claimed, had bucked off a dishonest man on sight. He trusted the animal more than Congress. Yet, there was also a deep moral rigor to him. He never owned a slave, not because of performative virtue, but because he genuinely could not stomach the moral contradiction. He believed in history as a force guided by divine justice. He saw the universe itself as governed by moral laws, and in that vision he saw himself as a necessary, even if unappreciated, instrument of correction. That didn't stop him from being angry all the time. He fought with nearly everyone. With Jefferson, then reconciled. With Franklin, then regretted. With himself, perpetually. But nothing haunted him like Washington's glow. He envied the ease with which the first president became an icon. Godlike, Adams called him, almost with a sneer. Where Washington commanded silence, Adams had to beg to be heard. Where Washington moved through rooms like an idea, Adams barged through like a rebuke. The myth of American unity lived in Washington's marble image. The dysfunction of American ambition lived in Adams' clenched jaw. And yet, at the end of his life, something poetic happened. On July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the Declaration of Independence, John Adams died. His final words, spoken as the light dimmed, were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." He was wrong. Jefferson had died just hours earlier. Neither knew. But the symmetry remained staggering. Two old rivals, co-authors of a revolution, departing the world on its most symbolic anniversary. Maybe that's what Adams had been waiting for. Not vindication, not applause, but that strange historical punchline. To die thinking your friend outlived you, only to learn you crossed the finish line together. Not as enemies, not as avatars of opposing ideologies, but as men who believed the experiment mattered, even if they shouted about it in different languages. Adams left behind no illusions, only letters, thousands of them, each one a flare fired into the future, warning, mocking, pleading, and beyond those letters, a trail of strange truths and volatile habits, hard cider, gossip, Latin curses, and horses who judged character better than most senators. Which brings us inescapably to the one he admired and despised in equal measure. He had red hair and a mumbling voice. He feared confrontation, but rewrote scripture. He brought a pasta machine across the ocean and stuffed a moose for science. If Adams was the conscience of the Republic, Jefferson was its elegant contradiction, restless, cerebral, and full of quietly radical obsessions. Thomas Jefferson, he moved like a whisper through the early Republic, never quite where you expected him, always taking notes. He rarely raised his voice and barely tolerated crowds, yet his fingerprints are on the bones of the nation. Its founding documents, its architecture, its contradictions. Thomas Jefferson was not built for thunder. He preferred murmurs, candlelight, and footnotes. He spoke in a soft, nearly inaudible mumble, so faint that dignitaries leaned forward to catch the meaning. When forced to address Congress, he refused to do it in person. Instead, he sent his speeches by messenger, silent declarations from a man who believed even authority should tread lightly. It wasn't cowardice, it was philosophy. Jefferson hated pomp, mistrusted theatricality. To speak too loudly was, in his view, to risk becoming a monarch. He compensated with the pen. Jefferson wrote obsessively, constantly, across thousands of letters, daily weather logs, and encrypted correspondence. He invented a device, the polygraph, a mechanical arm that copied every word he wrote to keep up with himself. He logged his garden yields and global temperatures. He wrote both law and dinner menus with equal intensity. But amid all this quiet intellect was something stranger. Jefferson, the man of the Enlightenment, the architect of liberty, the reluctant president, was also deeply, almost comically, bizarre. Take the moose. While serving as minister to France, Jefferson found himself in a debate with European naturalists who claimed that American wildlife was inferior to Europe's. Smaller, weaker, less evolved. Jefferson, offended in both national pride and scientific curiosity, decided to prove them wrong. He had a moose carcass shipped across the Atlantic, a decaying, antlered rebuttal, to display in a French salon. The logistics were nightmarish. The result, undocumented. But for Jefferson, the symbolism was enough. America was not just politically revolutionary, it was biologically superior. The Enlightenment demanded evidence. He mailed a moose. Then there was his relationship with food. Jefferson didn't just enjoy eating, he intellectualized it. He imported a macaroni machine from Italy. He served ice cream at the White House long before it became common. He cultivated over 300 types of vegetables at Monticello, his sprawling plantation laboratory. But nothing intrigued him quite like macaroni and cheese. Jefferson made it fashionable in elite society, serving it at state dinners with a solemnity typically reserved for treaties. Guests thought it strange. Jefferson considered it cultural diplomacy. He was also a man of strange rituals and superstitions, though he cloaked them in logic. Each morning, regardless of the season, he soaked his feet in cold water. He believed it prevented illness. Each evening, he documented temperature readings with a thermometer and barometer he carried like sacred relics. Jefferson was not afraid of death, but he feared disorder. Nature, when recorded properly, could be tamed. His personal philosophies often bordered on contradiction. He rewrote the Bible, quite literally, with scissors and glue. The Jefferson Bible removed miracles, divine interventions, and supernatural claims, leaving only the ethical teachings of Jesus. In Jefferson's eyes, morality needed no magic. Religion, if it must exist, should be reasonable. And yet, the man who stripped the Gospels of angels also believed in pseudoscientific theories, phrenology, hollow earth hypotheses. He allowed explorers to send him grizzly cubs and bare teeth. He surrounded himself with fossils and conjecture. Rationalism for Jefferson was less a destination than a labyrinth he wandered through at night, candle flickering, notebook in hand. Then there was the bacon grease. Among the many eccentricities of his daily life, Jefferson maintained a peculiar faith in its use, not for cooking, but for polishing boots. He believed it gave leather a better shine. His valet, it said, found the practice appalling. Jefferson insisted it was practical, a founding father wiping pork fat on his shoes. Convinced it brought dignity, it would be easy to laugh at these things, to place them beside his love of swivel chairs, coded letters, and mechanical closets. But Jefferson wasn't merely odd. He was architecturally odd. Every part of his life, his diet, his furniture, his theology, was designed, engineered, perfected, and re-perfected in quiet isolation. He preferred books to people, notes to dialogue, and contradiction to compromise. His silences were often louder than his proclamations. He once claimed to be a vegetarian, though he regularly consumed venison and ham. He advocated fiercely for liberty while owning hundreds of human beings. He called slavery a moral depravity, yet could not or would not free the system from his own hands. His mind envisioned equality. His land held chains. Even in death, he curated the final version of himself. Jefferson designed his own tombstone. It does not mention the presidency. Instead, it reads, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and father of the University of Virginia. Not president, not governor, not diplomat. To Jefferson, the written word mattered more than the wielded power. He wanted to be remembered for ideas, not office. But memory, like politics, has a mind of its own. Today, Jefferson is many things to many people. A symbol of reason, a contradiction in flesh, a poet of freedom whose life undermined his own verses, the man who saw a republic in the stars but couldn't clean the roof of Monticello, who collected clocks obsessively yet ran behind on moral time. And yet behind it all, the moose, the macaroni, the manuscript without miracles, there was always a sense that Jefferson was building something, not just a nation, but a blueprint for how one might think independently inside it. A design of ideals, fragile and unfinished. And while he designed quietly in Virginia, his friend, one of the smallest men ever to hold the presidency, was preparing something far more explosive. He didn't have Jefferson's charm or reach, but he had something else, an endless archive of fears, a voice too small to be heard, and a document written between seizures and breakdowns that would become the most quoted law in the land. His name was James Madison, and if Jefferson wrote the rough draft of America, Madison edited it from the edge of a nervous collapse. James Madison, he was barely over 5 feet tall and weighed less than 100 pounds. The fourth president of the United States could disappear into a crowd without anyone noticing, and more than once he did. Intentionally. James Madison was not a man of spectacle or presence. He was a man of rooms, corners, and silence. And yet, from those shadows, he helped write the words that would define American freedom, not with charisma, not with volume, but with obsessive focus and a mind that refused to stop running, even when the body could barely keep up. It wasn't just shyness. Madison's life was shaped by physical frailty, bouts of illness, and a near constant suspicion that his death might arrive at any moment. He suffered from chronic seizures, possibly epilepsy, and carried a deep, abiding fear of his own mortality. Friends worried. Enemies mocked. Madison himself documented his health with clinical devotion. His notebooks didn't just hold political theory, they held symptoms, pulse checks, anxiety tallies. He believed the mind could survive anything, if only the body could hold out long enough, and somehow it did. It was during one of his more delicate periods, recovering from what he called a nervous illness, that Madison sat down to draft what would become the Bill of Rights, 10 amendments to stitch together a fragile, argumentative, deeply divided country. He wrote not with confidence, but with urgency, not from triumph, but from exhaustion. Every word a quiet argument against tyranny, every clause a compromise between fear and hope. He believed deeply that liberty could only survive if carefully defined, that without boundaries, even freedom would devour itself. This wasn't abstract for Madison. Freedom had rules. Even conversation to him had limits. He avoided direct conflict whenever possible, preferring logic games and writing to settle disputes. When forced into public speaking, he often trembled. Once giving a speech in Congress, he fainted. Not metaphorically, he collapsed. His body simply couldn't bear the spotlight, and so he retreated into control, into routine, into strange little disciplines that, for Madison, were a form of armor. He wore the same style of black suit nearly every day of his adult life, It wasn't fashion, it was uniformity, a visual expression of internal discipline. His diet, too, followed rigid patterns. In his youth, he experimented with vegetarianism, believing that meat stirred violent emotions. He would go weeks eating only bread and vegetables. He was convinced that red meat, especially beef, was an angry food. He thought it clouded judgment, garlic too. He avoided it for the same reason he avoided passionate rhetoric. It was too volatile. His mind required stillness, even from dogs. Madison refused to own one, famously stating that barking disrupted his concentration while reading. His silence wasn't a quirk, it was a necessary condition for thinking. He took to strange behaviors to regulate his moods. He wore wool stockings year-round, claiming they calmed his nerves, even in Virginia's punishing heat. He measured his pulse obsessively, convinced that skipped beats were omens. He carried snuff in a gold box and used it frequently, believing the powdered tobacco soothed his thoughts. He spoke multiple languages: Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and sometimes inserted bits of each into letters, either to impress or to cloak meaning. Friends noticed a nervous tic. During debates or moments of stress, Madison would rub his hands together, sometimes for hours. Others noted that he hated being touched, even by loved ones. His physical standoffishness wasn't aloofness, it was anxiety in motion. Thunderstorms terrified him. During one particularly violent storm, he reportedly locked himself in the basement, refusing to emerge until the thunder passed. He told no one what he feared would happen, only that he didn't trust the sky to stay quiet. His beliefs extended into the metaphysical. Though a man of logic, Madison held quiet superstitions. He believed that reading novels was dangerous. They overstimulated the imagination and weakened moral resolve. He favored philosophy and law, often reading into the early hours by candlelight. Sleep was not something he indulged in. He rarely slept more than 4 or 5 hours a night, and when he did, he often dreamt of books attacking him, literal nightmares of being overwhelmed by knowledge. Some of his habits bordered on the obsessive. He believed that wind direction could affect mental clarity. He refused to look in mirrors during times of stress, believing vanity corroded the soul. He practiced handwriting drills into his 70s, maintaining that penmanship revealed one's inner order. He avoided open water, refused to cross rivers when storms loomed, and traveled only with a flask of whiskey in his coat, just in case. Liquor was medicine. Words were armor. He liked puzzles, ciphers, codes. The Constitution, in some sense, was his greatest puzzle, a document he hoped could adapt, bend, survive. But he knew what others often forgot, that no structure, no law, no republic could survive without restraint. He lived long, longer than most of the founding fathers. He outlived those who thought he wouldn't make it through college, through war, through public life. He died at 85, a quiet whisper in a loudening age. But what he left behind still echoes, a framework written during illness, maintained by sheer willpower and an alarming amount of wool. Madison's life wasn't grand. It was granular, built on footnotes, habits, and subtle compulsions. He was not a leader of people. He was a guardian of process, and when he passed that guardianship to his successor, it was not to someone of equal restraint, but to a man who carried a bullet in his body, named trees like friends, and spent nights crafting shadow puppets alone in his study. If Madison feared the sky, the next man feared mirrors, and when thunder struck, he didn't lock himself in the basement. He listened. James Monroe. He stood like a memory of another age, dressed in clothes that had long since fallen out of fashion, his powdered wig clinging stubbornly to the past. James Monroe was the last president to wear the garb of the Revolution, and in many ways, he remained its final ghost. He did not walk with the swagger of Jackson, nor carry the rhetorical polish of Jefferson. Instead, he carried something heavier, the weight of continuity and a bullet lodged in his shoulder from a war that had never quite left him. He had been wounded at the Battle of Trenton. The bullet was never removed. It stayed with him, nestled beneath skin and scar tissue, a silent reminder of the moment he became fused to the country's violent birth. For most of his life, Monroe carried that pain in silence. He spoke little of it. He favored motion instead, long walks, solitary rides, hours of silence. There was always something internal pulling him away from people and back toward the past. He did not seek company often. He did not cultivate charm. He disliked mirrors, avoided portraits, and rarely smiled in public. His home was lined with trees he named individually, tall, ancient things with identities he protected like confidants. He believed trees had personalities, perhaps even memories. They witnessed things. He often saluted them during his walks. In his personal notes, he sometimes addressed them directly. His domestic habits were, by any measure, peculiar. He wore outdated clothing for decades, ignoring fashion even as the country changed around him. His waistcoats remained Revolutionary War era in design. His gloves, worn even during summer, were silk, often dyed in somber hues. He explained it as tradition. Others called it stubbornness, but Monroe seemed less concerned with appearance than with consistency. He was a man who needed his world arranged just so, and nowhere was that more evident than in the way he kept his own company. By candlelight, long after others had gone to bed, Monroe would craft shadow puppets on his study walls, not for an audience, not even for family, just for himself. The shadows danced across bookshelves and framed documents. He called it a form of relaxation. In those quiet hours, with only the candle and the wall, Monroe's mind wandered into silhouettes. Half memory, half invention. It was not play, it was reflection. He believed dreams held meaning, practical meaning. He often slept in his study rather than his bedroom, saying the space channeled thoughts more clearly. Some nights he would wake and scribble notes, trying to decode messages sent in sleep. The line between rest and revelation was thin, and Monroe walked it every night. He was not a fan of crowds. He avoided speaking for the first hour of each morning, even to guests. It was a form of internal calibration. Words spoken too early, he believed, were wasted or untrue. If he had something important to say, he preferred to say it after walking, sometimes for miles. In rain, in heat, through mud. He believed walking gave thought momentum. Despite his reclusive habits, Monroe governed with a sense of almost sacred obligation. His presidency was dubbed the era of good feelings, a misnomer that masked deep political tensions. Monroe himself was anything but cheerful. He distrusted the growing urban centers, feared the rise of banks, and avoided paper currency whenever possible. He paid in coin. He preferred bartering. At times, he even stitched his own clothing rather than engage a tailor. He hated hot baths, believing they sapped energy. He took only cold ones, often early in the morning. He chewed licorice root during moments of stress and counted stairs aloud as he climbed them, a habit he claimed gave him control over disorder. And he once predicted a thunderstorm by scent alone. No one questioned him. He was right. Monroe was deeply suspicious of what he called unanchored technology. He distrusted the telegraph, refused most modern conveniences, and once declined a portrait, sitting until he was promised alcohol in exchange. The idea of being captured, on canvas or by camera, seemed to unsettle him. He believed portraits froze the soul at the wrong moment. Yet in public, he moved with steady confidence. He was the last of the founding generation to hold office, and he carried that legacy with visible solemnity. He rarely joked. He rarely strayed. He wore his ideals like he wore his powdered wig, out of step with the moment, but faithful to something older, something he thought shouldn't be forgotten. He was also quietly a collector of things, not valuables, not art, stones. He gathered one from every USA state, a private ritual he called Union Bones. They were stored in a wooden box with no label, no display, just stones, each from a different patch of dirt, a different corner of the growing country. He didn't tell people what they were, but when asked, he once replied, "You can't feel a nation's pulse without touching its skin." He believed deeply in the American experiment, but not as an idea that was ever finished. To Monroe, it was still forming, still fragile. His policies may have masked it with calm, but underneath he carried a constant fear that everything they'd fought for could still unravel. He saw threats everywhere, not dramatic ones, quiet ones, a shift in tone, a lapse in decorum, a tree cut down. In his later years, Monroe grew even quieter. He withdrew from political life with the same slow, deliberate pace that had always defined him. He continued his walks. He continued his ritual silence each morning. He spent hours in his garden speaking softly to the squirrels he had once tried to keep out. By then, he simply let them be. He died, like Adams and Jefferson before him, on July 4th. Another strange symmetry. another ghost of revolution slipping out on the country's birthday. He was the third president to die on Independence Day. They said he left quietly, but if you listened, you could almost hear the echo of his footsteps on the stairs, the rustle of silk gloves, the faint murmur of shadow puppets flickering on the study wall, and as the trees stood still in the summer air, one might imagine Monroe offering them a final, solemn salute. The next president, however, would offer no such courtesy. He woke before dawn, swam nude in the Potomac, talked to plants, scolded strangers, and argued with the sky. Where Monroe whispered to trees, this man lectured birds. Where Monroe collected stones, this one measured morality by miles walked. If Monroe was the final breath of the revolution, his successor was the strange, unfiltered exhale of a new American century. His name was John Quincy Adams, and he didn't care if anyone thought he was odd. John Quincy Adams. He began each day by stripping down and walking into the Potomac River, completely naked, no guards, no ceremony, just the sixth president of the United States, disappearing beneath the morning surface like a ghost, re-entering the flesh. It wasn't vanity. It wasn't rebellion. It was a ritual. Solitary, cold, necessary. To John Quincy Adams, clarity came not from power, but from immersion. There's something uncanny about the man. Unlike his father, whose temper was volcanic and visible, John Quincy was a storm held entirely beneath the surface. He didn't rage. He calculated. He didn't socialize. He marched. His daily walks could span miles, 5, 10, sometimes more. He would talk to himself the entire time. Not as a madman, but as a man who had learned long ago that dialogue was safest when held in private. And if those walks weren't enough to stir clarity, there was always the alligator. It was a gift, naturally, from the Marquis de Lafayette, who must have known that John Quincy Adams wouldn't blink at the idea of housing a reptile in the executive mansion. Most presidents would have declined. Adams accepted it and let it roam in a bathroom. There's no record of him naming it. There's also no indication he warned visitors before they entered. This was how Adams communicated with the world, indirectly, cryptically, and always with a degree of moral challenge. The alligator wasn't just a pet, it was a question left unasked. What do you fear, and why are you standing so close to it? He feared very little himself, but distrusted nearly everything, especially ease, joy, indulgence, celebration. These were viewed with suspicion. He refused to dance. He refused to gamble. He lectured strangers on morality if he overheard them cursing. And every night he gave himself a letter grade for his own behavior. A grown man, president of the United States, assigning himself marks in categories like temperance, dignity, and purpose. The entries still survive. C+ for silence, B for courage, F for indulgent dessert at luncheon. This was not performance. This was how he measured his soul. Adams saw life as a moral syllabus, and he never missed an assignment. His diary spanned more than 60 years and over 15,000 pages, an ocean of thoughts, criticisms, debates with himself. In those pages, you can find a man wrestling with ethics, debating God, and sometimes simply cataloging the birds outside his window. He believed animals had a moral compass. He talked to birds. He spoke to his plants. He saw in nature something most people ignored, a conversation that didn't need human input. When he was president, his administration ran cold and quiet. He did not charm, he did not flatter, but he worked. And when he left office, bitterly, reluctantly, he returned to public service anyway. Not out of glory, but duty. He once argued in front of the Supreme Court, years after his presidency, defending the captives of the Amistad. He stood there, small, severe, and aging, delivering a legal and moral thunderbolt on behalf of people most Americans didn't want to think about. He won. He would walk backward up hills as a form of self-discipline. He believed silence could be an act of protest. He once fasted for an entire weekend because he believed his soul had become complacent. And if you asked him why, he would not offer explanation. He would simply continue walking. John Quincy Adams was not a man of gestures. He was a man of patterns, of repeated trials. His entire existence was a lifelong debate with conscience, a debate in which no one else was qualified to moderate. If his father's legacy had loomed over him, and it did, he met it not by eclipsing it, but by outlasting it. He died at his desk. Literally, a stroke, mid-session in the Capitol building. He had returned to Congress not because he had to, but because he didn't believe he was finished yet. The nation kept changing, and Adams wanted to keep asking it hard questions. There is a quiet sadness in him, not tragedy, he wouldn't allow that word, but something heavier. A man who swam in the dark because it cleared his mind, who kept an alligator in the White House because it didn't require conversation, who talked to himself not because no one else would listen, but because no one else could understand the vocabulary. He left no heirs of personality, no school of politics, only notes, walks, and the quiet example of how exhausting integrity can become when it's your only religion. And when the Capitol walls finally stopped echoing his voice, the country didn't fall into silence. It fell into something louder, a gunshot, then another, both misfired, and the man they were meant for didn't flinch. He beat his would-be assassin with a cane until he was dragged away. John Quincy Adams fought ideas. His successor fought everything else. He slept with pistols, spat tobacco in cabinet meetings, and believed banks were the enemy of man. His name was Andrew Jackson. And if Adams was the conscience of America, Jackson was its bare-knuckle brawler. Andrew Jackson. The story begins with 2 pistol clicks and no bullets. The would-be assassin stood in a puff of smoke, eyes wide with disbelief. The president stood in fury, not fear, not confusion, fury. Andrew Jackson, in his 7th decade of life, lunged at the man and beat him with his cane until bystanders dragged him off. He did not scream. He did not speak. He struck, again and again. Both pistols had misfired. A miracle, some said. Jackson didn't think so. He believed the Almighty still had work for him to do. Most others suspected the devil just wasn't ready yet. Jackson was the first president who seemed to move entirely on raw force of will. He was a self-made man, in the brutal, literal sense. Born poor, orphaned young, captured by the British at 13, slashed in the face with a sword when he refused to polish an officer's boots. The scar never faded. He kept it as a kind of prophecy. He lived like a man trying to punish the world for what it had done to him, and the world, for reasons still difficult to explain, gave him the presidency. Jackson's presence in the White House was not subtle. It was not polished. It was not quiet. His staff developed a system of code words to soften his profanity in official transcripts. He once referred to Congress as a bunch of crows pecking at a corpse. He called dinner parties a waste of bourbon and breath. And when it came to banks, he saw not just corruption, but evil. He waged a personal war against the National Bank and emerged victorious, shoveling the country into economic uncertainty just to prove it could be done. He didn't trust banks at all. Instead, he hid his personal fortune in literal jars buried around his property. It was less a financial strategy than a worldview. Money to Jackson was safest underground. Power belonged to the man with the shovel. Then there was the parrot. Polly was its name, Jackson's loyal companion in his final years. When the president died, they brought the bird to the funeral. It was supposed to be a touching scene. It became something else entirely. The parrot began to scream obscenities. So many, and with such volume, that mourners had to remove it from the chapel. No one was surprised. It had lived in Jackson's home after all. Where else would it have learned that vocabulary? Even his animals were unpredictable. Jackson's distrust wasn't limited to banks or enemies. He believed mirrors were dangerous if stared at too long. He consulted a personal astrologer in secret. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow every night, sometimes two. He once installed a cannon outside his bedroom for protection, from whom no one ever quite determined. He kept dogs in his bedroom, horses in his field, and in the depths of his paranoia, he gave nicknames to everyone, including furniture. His favorite chair was the General. He called the fireplace the only honest thing in Washington. He chewed tobacco constantly and spat it wherever he pleased. Even in cabinet meetings, he preferred candles to oil lamps because they were, in his words, warmer in spirit. And though he detested doctors, he swore by vinegar and molasses as medicine. For what? Everything. Jackson's legacy, even now, is a minefield. He was a war hero and a populist. He was also a slave owner and architect of Indian removal. His name is carved into the bones of the nation, but so are the names of the thousands displaced by his policies. For every common man who cheered his defiance, There was a family forced from their home to march west into dust and silence. He did not apologize. He did not bend. He believed to the end that history would justify him, and perhaps in his final moments, he thought it had. He died saying he had done God's work. Whether he meant that as absolution or accusation, no one ever knew. But in death, as in life, Andrew Jackson left no room for neutrality. You were either with him or beneath him, and when the dust settled over his cane, his pistols, and his parrot, the country turned, not to someone stronger or louder, but to someone stranger, a man with lavender gloves and perfect sideburns, a man who spent an hour each day grooming and refused to say the word ain't, a man who believed orange was a theme, not just a color. His name was Martin Van Buren, and he didn't need to yell. He just needed everything to match. Martin Van Buren. He was the first president born after the United States became a country, and yet in almost every way, Martin Van Buren seemed older than the Republic itself. He was meticulous, fashion-obsessed, and spoke with the kind of carefully measured diction that made even casual conversation sound like an oath. His first language wasn't English, it was Dutch, and his politics, though modern in ambition, moved with the elegance and evasiveness of an old-world waltz. Van Buren was short, soft-spoken, and almost surgical in the way he managed his image. He wore extra-tight trousers, not for comfort, but for symmetry. His sideburns were legendary, twin arcs of reddish-brown precision that took nearly an hour each morning to perfect. Grooming wasn't just a routine for Van Buren, it was ritual. He believed a statesman's credibility began with his silhouette. And when it came to appearances, he didn't stop at his own. He once hosted a dinner where everything, the tablecloths, the candles, even the food, was orange. Not accidentally, not thematically, religiously. The drinks were tinted, the desserts glazed. The guests, somewhat confused, whispered to one another beneath their carrot-colored napkins. Van Buren smiled, but offered no explanation. To him, coherence was its own kind of governance. He hated the word ain't, calling it a linguistic crime. He never used contractions in public speech. He preferred complete sentences. He preferred clarity, but more than that, he preferred control. He collected canes. Over 200, most of them with strange carving or secret compartments. Some were never used. Others never left his sight. His favorite was a dark wood walking stick with a hollowed handle where he kept peppermint candies. He offered them to guests not as hospitality, but as a gesture of dominance, an unspoken rule. You may be seated, but you're on my time now. Van Buren's political style was no less curated. Nicknamed the Little Magician, he moved through Washington like a fog with a law degree. Never quite visible, never quite absent. He built coalitions in whispers and dissolved enemies with the flick of a procedural motion. He didn't command loyalty, he orchestrated it. Behind every handshake was a ledger. Behind every bill, a blueprint. Van Buren didn't need brute force. He had timing. But beneath that velvet control was a man driven by an almost manic need to engineer harmony. He feared asymmetry. He measured sleep patterns. He reportedly kept a journal of dreams, color-coding them by emotional tone. He once refused entry to a visitor who called him Marty, claiming it was an informal mutilation. His gloves were always lavender-scented, his handkerchiefs embroidered, his public persona spotless. And yet, like all meticulous systems, Van Buren's world was fragile. He hated beards, considering them signs of instability. He believed umbrellas should match suits and called red garments socially untrustworthy. He carried a custom toothpick case shaped like a miniature carriage. He gave thank you notes to trees and once referred to a gust of wind as a sigh from Providence. Van Buren saw the world in symbols. Everything meant something. Nothing was random. He had no military experience, and he proudly emphasized that. While his predecessors rose through gunpowder and battlefield scars, Van Buren rose through committees, coalitions, and careful vocabulary. He was a master of process, a believer in government not as force but as form. But the nation increasingly didn't want to form. It wanted impact. And Van Buren, for all his finesse, couldn't stop what was coming. Economic collapse, political polarization, a loud and growing call for rougher edges. He lost re-election. badly. The country had grown impatient with his quiet genius, his symmetrical menus, his lavender gloves, and when he stepped away from the presidency, he didn't retreat into silence. He just returned to routine. Peppermints, polished shoes, solitaire, played daily, with wins and losses meticulously logged. He had a fear of falling downstairs and always held the railing with both hands. He whistled while reading, though poorly. He trimmed his sideburns with a small silver comb and believed that each hair told its own story. Martin Van Buren didn't see himself as a politician. He saw himself as an architect of taste, a conductor of coherence in a world that refused to stay aligned, and perhaps that's why the next president felt like such a jolt. He arrived on horseback, in the rain, gave a 2-hour speech with no coat or hat, then died 31 days later. His name was William Henry Harrison, and in that single month he managed to confuse misfortune, defy medicine, and talk to his own hat. William Henry Harrison. He rode into Washington as if the office itself might vanish before he arrived. He was the oldest president elected at the time, 68, with windburned skin, a face creased by war and frontier life, and a voice that refused to tremble. William Henry Harrison was a general, a folkloric relic from a time when log cabins still meant something. He believed in symbolism more than safety, and on the day he took office, he believed that symbolism would keep him warm. It did not. Harrison gave the longest inauguration speech in American history, 8,445 words, spoken in freezing rain and punishing wind. No coat, no hat, no caution. He stood there, coatless and exposed, as if defying both weather and mortality. Spectators watched in disbelief. The wind clawed at his sleeves. The sky closed in. He didn't care. This wasn't just a speech. It was a declaration, not of policy, but of endurance. Then 31 days later, he died. Pneumonia, they said, or typhoid, or something else the rain carried with it. The irony was brutal. The shortest presidency in American history, 1 month and 1 day. And yet it began with the longest speech ever delivered. It felt like a cosmic joke. But Harrison wasn't laughing, and neither, frankly, was his hat. Because yes, he spoke to his hat. He referred to it as the voice of caution. Before important meetings, he would hold it in his lap and mumble into it. Staff sometimes found him in the hallway, murmuring strategy into the crown of his broad-brimmed beaver felt. It wasn't performance, it was superstition. Harrison believed the hat filtered his thoughts, tamed them before they escaped. He also believed that smoking corncob pipes backward could confuse misfortune, not prevent it, not destroy it, confuse it, as if fate were a dog that could be tricked by a sleight of hand. He practiced the habit routinely, puffing the wrong way and exhaling philosophical phrases about destiny and mud. Most people assumed Harrison was an antique, a leftover artifact from the frontier wars, more log cabin than statesman, but that wasn't quite true. He understood narrative. He played the log cabin myth like a violin. His campaign paraded barrels of hard cider through town squares. His supporters sang jingles about his simple roots. The truth was more complex. He came from privilege. But Harrison understood what the country wanted, or thought it wanted: a man of the land, a war hero, a general who needed no umbrella. He was obsessed with health in ways that bordered on the performative. He took cold baths. He walked barefoot at night. He once claimed that shoes dull the senses. He drank vinegar mixed with molasses as a tonic, and kept a leather pouch of garlic cloves on him at all times, convinced they warded off lung disease. He slept on a straw mattress, even in the White House, saying that softness spoils the spine. But Harrison's quirks weren't merely eccentricities. They were rituals of control. He had seen chaos up close, in the smoke of the War of 1812, in the blood of fallen scouts. And he knew, better than most, that control was an illusion. Still, he tried. He kept his boots tied in a precise double knot. He aligned furniture to face cardinal directions. He carried a pocket compass that he consulted every morning, not to navigate, but to orient his soul. His favorite meals were bland: boiled vegetables, weak coffee, unsalted grits. He distrusted flavor. He said it inflamed the imagination. And yet he could tell stories for hours. Around fires, on porches, in political meetings. He had a voice that pulled people in. not by volume, but by cadence. When he spoke of battle, people leaned forward. When he spoke of destiny, they forgot their tea was going cold. And then he became president. For 31 days, he spent most of that time trying to assert control over a system that barely had time to recognize him. He met with dozens of office seekers. He wrote letters. He walked the gardens, even in bad weather. Especially in bad weather. He believed the damp air cleared the lungs. But nature had other plans. When he fell ill, he resisted treatment. Doctors offered brandy, mustard plasters, laudanum. He refused most of it. He mumbled to his hat. He lit a pipe backward. He said he only needed one good sleep. Instead, he grew weaker. The coughing deepened. The fever climbed. And then, in a room still echoing with speeches about endurance, the general finally slept. They tried to make sense of it. A speech too long. A coat not worn. A curse from above. But perhaps the explanation was simpler. William Henry Harrison had spent his life walking into storms to prove he wasn't afraid, until one of them didn't flinch. His body was carried out with quiet dignity. The country mourned, but already the machinery of succession groaned awake, and into the vacuum stepped a man nobody wanted. Not really. A vice president chosen to appease voters, now elevated by fate. He wasn't even supposed to be there. He held mock trials for his pets, sprinkled salt in his shoes for moral grounding, and gave his children assigned days of the week to speak at the dinner table. His name was John Tyler, and when asked what he believed in, he usually said, "Order." John Tyler. He entered the presidency like a man walking into a room no one meant for him. John Tyler was not elected to lead. He was a footnote turned headline, a vice president tacked onto the ticket for regional balance. A Virginia aristocrat with a soft voice, hard opinions, and no illusions that anyone really wanted him there. But then Harrison died, 31 days in, and just like that, John Tyler became the 10th president of the United States. The Constitution didn't yet have clear instructions for this scenario. The wording was ambiguous. Did he become the acting president? A placeholder? A regent? Tyler didn't ask. He just took the oath, and from that moment forward, he insisted again and again that he was not vice anything. He was the president. Period. His cabinet disagreed. Congress balked, but Tyler had already made up his mind. Once, while visiting a tailor, he referred to the presidency as an accident of fate, but not of will. Fate might have opened the door. Tyler slammed it shut behind him. He was a man of routines so strange and precise they often bordered on the ceremonial. Each morning he sprinkled a pinch of salt into his leather shoes before stepping outside. Moral grounding, he called it. The salt, he believed, warded off spiritual drift. He never explained what that meant. His children, 15 of them by the end, were assigned designated days of the week to speak at dinner, not just to keep order, but to teach patience. Monday was for John Jr., Tuesday for Mary. On Sunday, no one spoke. Meals were taken in silence, forks clinking, eyes lowered. The lesson was simple. Power begins with restraint, and yet Tyler himself was anything but restrained. He held mock trials for his pets, literally. His spaniel, Wig, was once accused of stealing a turkey bone. The trial lasted an hour. Tyler served as judge and jury. He fashioned a tiny gavel and banged it 3 times before delivering a verdict. Guilty, with leniency. The dog was pardoned, but sentenced to a week without gravy. His children, watching in horror or delight, learned something unclear but deeply memorable. He loathed confrontation in public, but savored it in private. His letters are filled with biting commentary, veiled jabs, and metaphysical brooding. He could quote Shakespeare by memory, but refused to say the word politician without spitting afterward. He believed the term had become a synonym for pretense. Tyler kept a small library of legal books in his private quarters, arranged not by author, but by how much he trusted their judgment. He ranked them A through F, annotating in the margins with judgments like too French, overconfident, or simply deluded. He did not believe in coincidence. He once stopped a treaty negotiation because the clock in the room struck 13. He said the air felt disrupted. The meeting was rescheduled. He never explained further, but perhaps his most defining oddity was not in how he governed, but in how he lived inside the contradictions of leadership. He was a strict constructionist who expanded presidential power when it benefited him, He championed states' rights while using executive orders liberally. He vetoed bills from his own party so often and with such unapologetic flair that the Whigs disowned him. Literally, they kicked him out of his own political party while he was still in office, the first and only president to ever be politically orphaned by his own. He did not care. Tyler doubled down, moved faster, signed more vetoes, refused to change course. When political cartoonists mocked him, he clipped their work and filed it in a drawer, labeled "Regrets of the Misinformed." He did not enjoy crowds. He preferred music played slowly, preferably on a harpsichord. He wore gloves at all times when shaking hands. He disliked cities and feared elevators, which were just emerging in public buildings. He referred to them as mechanical temptations. When asked for clarification, he only said, "If God wanted men to rise without climbing, he would have given us wings." Tyler was not beloved. He was not even respected in many circles, but he was deliberate, and that deliberation lasted long past his presidency. In his later years, he supported the Confederacy. He accepted election to its Provisional Congress, becoming the only U.S. president to openly align with a rebellion against the Union. When he died, Lincoln refused to acknowledge the death publicly. No flags at half-mast, no mention in the halls of Washington. It was as if he had been erased in real time. But erasure is never complete. John Tyler's legacy lingers, not just in textbooks, but in the strangeness he brought to power, in the rituals, the mock trials, the silent dinners, the salt in his shoes, and the defiance in his pen. He walked into history by accident and refused to walk back out. James K. Polk. He made promises and kept them with terrifying precision. 4 goals, 4 years, no re-election. James K. Polk treated the presidency like a siege, swift, brutal, and without second chances. He did not aim to inspire. He aimed to complete it. By the time he left office, the borders of the United States had expanded by more than 1 million square miles, and Polk was too exhausted to enjoy a minute of it. He was a man of outlines, of clipped syllables and cold glances. There was no charisma. There was only execution. Polk entered the world under the weight of surgical steel. At 17, he underwent a harrowing operation to remove urinary stones. There was no anesthesia. The procedure involved cutting into the bladder, pulling out stones by hand. He was fully conscious the entire time. His mother later claimed he didn't cry. He later claimed he remembered everything. After that, pain became something else. Something measurable. Something beatable. He never had children. He rarely drank. He distrusted joy. When he finally reached the presidency, he banned dancing at his inaugural ball, the only president in history to do so. It wasn't prudery, it was discipline. Dancing, in Polk's view, signaled indulgence. Indulgence inevitably led to disorder, and disorder was an offense to the very idea of governance. He had his goals, and he had his calendar. Secure Oregon, settle the border with Britain, annex California, reform the Treasury. He did all of it. Then quietly, he declined a second term. He was tired, not symbolically tired, bodily, drained in a way that suggested not political fatigue, but spiritual attrition. During his presidency, he worked 12 to 16-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week, reading every document personally, annotating margins with increasingly sharp handwriting. He reviewed speeches with a ruler in hand, underlining offending phrases and rewording them with mechanical force. One aide called him a clock that strikes on time, even when no one is listening. He read compulsively. He edited compulsively. He once burned a letter from a supporter, not because of its content, but because it had too many exclamation points. Emotion, he wrote in his journal, is no excuse for poor punctuation. That letter, like many things that displeased him, vanished in flame. His handwriting was immaculate. He carried 3 pens, each sharpened to a different pressure. He preferred blue ink, but only in the afternoon. Black was reserved for official mourning. He drafted his own funeral instructions at age 38, not because he expected to die young, but because he expected to die exhausted. Polk had a deep mistrust of ceremony. He believed politics should be boring. Grandstanding disgusted him. He once delayed a cabinet meeting because someone arrived with a ribbon on their lapel. "We are not monarchs," he said. "We are functionaries." Yet when guests came to dinner, he had a precise arrangement of forks and candles, each placed by Polk himself. Symmetry was not elegance. It was moral correctness. He rarely smiled in public photographs. His gaze, often slightly narrowed, gave the impression of permanent judgment. Children found him unsettling. Dogs growled at him. Staff members walked more quietly when he entered a room. And yet, underneath the unrelenting formality, there was a man of volcanic energy. He expanded a nation. He provoked a war. He negotiated borders with the finesse of a man threading needles blindfolded. He changed the map more than perhaps any other president, and did so while treating personal comfort like a vice. He did not believe in distraction. He did not play instruments. He did not attend theater. He considered fiction a dangerous use of paper. He collected rocks, but only ones he could classify without sentiment. Polk did not govern as a man seeking admiration. He governed as if he were a temporary steward of a machine, built by the founders, now rusting, now fragile, in need of cleaning and calibration. He did not dream, he fixed. And when the fixing was done, so was he. After 4 years of mechanical intensity, Polk retired. He had fulfilled every campaign promise, a feat almost no president has matched. But within 3 months of leaving office, he died. The official cause was cholera, but those close to him believed it was something else. The presidency had consumed him, fully, precisely, the way he had always planned. He left behind no children, no dynasty, no nostalgia, only maps. And as his body cooled, the presidency passed not to another conqueror, but to a man who would neither conquer nor command. A man who banned pepper, hid money in barn walls, and refused, even as president, to cast a vote. His name was Zachary Taylor, and he governed like he was still wearing boots caked in battlefield mud. Zachary Taylor. He never voted, not once. Not for dog catcher, not for sheriff, and not even for president. Not even for himself. Zachary Taylor, 12th President of the United States, ascended to the highest office in the land without ever having cast a ballot. He didn't believe in voting, he believed in duty, and the two to him weren't necessarily the same. He was a general first, a politician never, and a man most comfortable when surrounded by the scent of gunpowder and horse sweat. In office, he seemed out of place, as if the White House were a temporary shelter erected between campaigns. He moved through its halls like he was still expecting to hear musket fire. His boots clacked loudly on the polished floors, still caked in dust from trails long behind him. He distrusted formality, refused to wear full-dress uniforms, often showed up to state dinners in plain clothes. He ate quickly, spoke sparingly, and watched people as if measuring whether they'd flinch in battle. And yet, his convictions were not the loud kind. They revealed themselves in quieter, stranger ways. Taylor believed that black pepper damaged digestion, not metaphorically, not as a dietary preference. He saw it as a genuine health hazard. As president, he banned pepper from all White House meals. Guests who asked for it were quietly handed salt instead. Some thought it was a joke. Taylor did not explain. He simply ate in silence. He also didn't trust banks. This too wasn't symbolic. He kept his savings hidden in hand-forged nails embedded in barn walls. Nails, plural, each one hollowed out, each containing folded currency, sometimes gold. The locations were known only to him and, possibly, to his most loyal stable hands. When pressed about this practice, he would grunt and say, "The ground's more honest than a vault." Taylor had the weathered, sun-leathered look of a man who'd spent most of his life squinting across open plains. His speech was thick with frontier cadence. His teeth were yellow from years of pipe tobacco, and his hands bore the scars of saddle leather, sword hilts, and years of cold field mornings. He wasn't an ideologue. He wasn't even particularly loyal to his party. In fact, the Whigs only nominated him because they believed a war hero was their best shot at winning. Taylor, for his part, barely campaigned. He refused to pander. Most of his speeches were delivered by surrogates. When elected, he seemed mildly irritated by the outcome. One of his first comments after hearing the result was, "I suppose I'll need a proper suit." He rarely gave speeches, and when he did, they were awkward, stiff, interrupted by throat clearing and long pauses. His supporters called it humility. His critics called it illiteracy. Both were wrong. Taylor wasn't dumb. He was guarded. The battlefield had trained him to measure his words, not broadcast them. His daily rituals were simple and rigid. He rose early, drank weak coffee, and took solitary walks through the White House gardens. Boots still muddy from yesterday, pepper nowhere in sight. He whittled, smoked, and sometimes stared at the horizon for hours without speaking. One aide noted, "He carries silence like a musket." He disliked large gatherings and only tolerated them when necessary. At state events, he'd often disappear early, retreating to a private corner with a tin cup of water and a handful of unsalted biscuits. He didn't believe in indulgence, he believed in readiness. He slept lightly, always with a pistol within reach. Even in the White House. He was not a man of grand philosophies, but when the question of slavery's expansion arose, Taylor, despite being a slaveholder himself, surprised everyone. He threatened to personally lead troops against any state that attempted secession. "The Union must stand," he said, "even if I must stand it alone." And perhaps he would have. But he never got the chance. On July 4th, 1850, after attending a long, sweltering Independence Day celebration, Taylor returned to the White House and consumed a strange combination of raw fruit, ice milk, and chilled cherries. He fell ill almost immediately. His stomach turned against him. For days, he burned with fever, racked by cramps and delirium. Doctors arrived, bled him, dosed him, fed him calomel and opium. Nothing worked. 5 days later, he died. The official diagnosis was gastroenteritis, but rumors have lingered ever since. Poison, some whispered. A Southern conspiracy. A slow, calculated assassination by men who feared his stance on secession. Decades later, his body was even exhumed to test for arsenic. The results were inconclusive. The mystery remains. What's certain is that he left the presidency just as abruptly as he'd entered it. Without warning, without ceremony, without a second term. He had come from the field, and to the field he returned. Taylor left behind no memoirs, no grand farewell address, just a barn wall full of hollow nails, a vanished pepper shaker, and a presidency that lasted barely 16 months. The man who followed him, by contrast, preferred things tidy, overly tidy. He trimmed candle wicks during meals, he read the dictionary for pleasure, and he refused to shake hands with anyone whose fingernails weren't perfectly even. His name was Millard Fillmore, and he made fastidiousness into a form of national policy. Millard Fillmore. His name was already a punchline before he ever took office. Millard Fillmore. A president whose syllables felt like a bureaucratic sigh. He wasn't born into power, war, or fame. He was born in a log cabin, apprenticed to a clothmaker, and climbed, slowly, neatly, obsessively, to the top. He was not a man of chaos. He was a man of order, and not just political order, moral order, the kind that can only be maintained by candlelight trimmed with precision. During his presidency, guests at the White House often noticed that candles burned evenly and steadily, never flickering or pooling. That was no accident. Fillmore trimmed the wicks himself, often during meals, even during state dinners. If a candle guttered or burned off center, he would stop speaking mid-sentence, lean forward, and snip it with a tiny pair of golden scissors. Conversations paused. Silverware froze. The flame corrected, and only then would the president resume his thought. Fillmore wasn't trying to make a statement. He simply couldn't not do it. He read the entire Webster's Dictionary, twice. Not for policy, for pleasure. He annotated definitions, circled etymologies, and ranked words by elegance. Serendipity was one of his favorites. He once argued, during a cabinet meeting, that its rise in popularity signaled a dangerous cultural pivot toward accident and whim. The room fell silent. No one knew what he wanted them to do with that. He was fastidious to the point of superstition. Before any public appearance, he checked his fingernails, then the fingernails of his aides. Then, if handshakes were expected, he would discreetly glance at the nails of his guests. Uneven ones made him visibly tense. When asked why, he replied only, "As within, so without." His wardrobe was immaculate. Pressed cuffs, symmetrical collars, matching socks, even on Sundays. He had his shoes polished twice a day and kept a spare set of gloves in every room of the White House. Not because he feared dirt, because he feared asymmetry. He rose at the same time each day, 4:45 a.m., to the sound of a chime he had specially commissioned. Not a bell, a chime, toned to B flat. He claimed it set his brain into the proper frequency. He began every morning by reading a page from the dictionary and a passage from a legal treatise. He then inspected the White House hallways for dust or moral drift. He disliked fiction, especially novels with unresolved endings. He said ambiguity made people lazy. He favored biographies of men who died with clean desks. In his own study, the inkwell was always full. Pens laid parallel, paper aligned with the edge of the desk. If someone moved a chair, he noticed and corrected. He did not smile often. His laughter, when it came, was brief and nasal. Staff described it as a polite cough with feelings. His sense of humor was strictly alphabetical. He once joked that the word rumpus was a linguistic abomination and should be outlawed. No one laughed. He didn't mind. Fillmore's politics were moderate, often maddeningly so. He signed the Fugitive Slave Act, a decision that shredded what remained of the Whig Party and earned him the disdain of abolitionists. And yet he personally opposed slavery. Deeply, viscerally. He considered it a stain on the Republic, but he valued balance more than reform, compromise more than clarity. He believed history would vindicate the peacemakers. It did not. In private, he was not cruel, just clinical. He believed emotion had its place, and that place was after dinner. He designed his own stationery. He corrected grammar in invitations. He refused to eat meals served in mismatched china. And once, when presented with a new White House rug, he demanded it be rotated monthly to preserve spatial equity. He liked rain. He believed it scrubbed not just streets, but spirits. On stormy afternoons, he often walked the halls in soft slippers, hands behind his back, reciting passages from Blackstone's commentaries aloud. It soothed him. Visitors sometimes mistook it for madness. It was just Millard. Despite his stiffness, he had habits that hinted at something stranger. He kept a notebook titled Unspoken Corrections, where he silently documented every grammatical mistake he encountered. He never shared it, just logged the errors in small, perfect cursive, then placed the notebook back in his drawer. When his term ended, he slipped quietly from the stage. No grand farewell, no parade, just a well-pressed coat, a soft nod, and a walk back into private life, where he continued to trim candles, read dictionaries, and mourn the world's refusal to arrange itself. He would outlive nearly all his contemporaries, outlast every trace of the Whig Party, and spend his final years in Buffalo, New York, declining invitations to speak at public events because microphones distort tone. But the next man did not fear distortion. He turned mirrors to face the wall before bed. He saluted trees while drunk, and he gave one of those trees a name, Martha the Witness. His name was Franklin Pierce. And if Fillmore was control, Pierce was collapse dressed in evening wear. Franklin Pierce. He was handsome, devastatingly so, with dark eyes that always seemed to be looking for the nearest exit. Franklin Pierce moved through politics like a man sleepwalking through a burning house, aware of the flames, unwilling to wake. He smiled easily, drank deeply, and carried the heavy scent of someone who knew, down to his marrow, that he was never supposed to be here. And maybe he wasn't. He never stopped mourning. Not really. Not even at his own inauguration. 2 months before taking office, Pierce and his wife watched their last surviving child die in a train accident. The boy's body was crushed before their eyes. The grief was total. His wife turned to spiritualism. Pierce turned to bourbon. That grief was never hidden. It simply became part of his rhythm. He began turning all the mirrors in his home to face the wall before bed. He said he couldn't sleep with reflections watching. When guests asked about it, he'd mutter something about unfinished business, then change the subject. The mirrors were never turned back until morning. He began to see signs everywhere. On a campaign stop in New Hampshire, Pierce tripped over a small flag and stumbled into a tree. He was, by all accounts, drunk. He stood, brushed himself off, and saluted the tree. Then he began reciting parts of the Declaration of Independence to it. No one stopped him. Most just applauded, unsure whether it was performance or breakdown. Pierce, ever the gentleman, concluded with a bow. That tree became a metaphor for his presidency. He named another one back home in Concord, an old, weather-battered pine. He called it Martha the Witness. He refused to let anyone cut it down. When asked who Martha was, he only said, "She remembers." Whether he meant the tree or someone else was never clear. Franklin Pierce governed like a man under hypnosis. He was affable, polished, and rhetorically gifted, but his decisions were haunted by compromise and avoidance. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a move that effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise and flung the country toward civil war. Pierce hoped it would bring peace through balance. Instead, it brought blood. He watched the nation tear itself open while insisting it was just bruised. Behind closed doors, his habits deepened. He drank late into the night, often alone. Staff would find empty glasses beneath piles of papers, some with notes scribbled in margins. Half poems, half regrets. He refused to seek treatment. He believed suffering was a form of atonement. He kept a handkerchief embroidered with his son's initials in his coat pocket at all times. He wore it threadbare. Toward the end of his term, the monogram was nearly invisible. When asked why he still carried it, he simply said, "Because someone should." Pierce believed in the power of ceremony, but distrusted its sincerity. He could deliver stirring addresses while privately mocking the audience under his breath. He once held a private dinner for foreign dignitaries where the seating arrangement spelled out the word hollow in Morse code. It was never acknowledged, just arranged, just present. He was not cruel, but he was increasingly unreachable. He walked barefoot in his garden at dusk, believed it clarified the blood. He kept a notebook titled "Corrections I Will Not Make," filled with policies he wished he'd vetoed, bills he'd signed too quickly, people he'd trusted too much. He read from it every Sunday. No one else ever saw it. When his term ended, the nation exhaled. Pierce did not run again. His party left him behind, and he slipped into private life with the quiet sigh of a man finally leaving the wrong room. But he didn't disappear. He wandered, traveled alone, showed up unannounced to events, lectured strangers on the virtues of dignity. At one event, he was asked to toast the Constitution. He raised his glass, stared into it for a long time, then said only, "It was good while it lasted." He died quietly, liver-scarred, reputation in tatters, name rarely spoken, and yet something of him lingers in every tragic decision, dressed in good intentions, in every man who smiles through failure, in every policy meant to please everyone that ends up pleasing no one. He turned away from mirrors because he didn't like what he saw. The man who followed him didn't turn away. He welcomed the silence. He kept a hermit crab named Hermes the Silent. He wore a glass eye, not to see, but to unsettle. He believed sneezing could purge lies from the room. His name was James Buchanan, and he walked through the final years of a breaking nation with deliberate slowness, as if hoping history wouldn't notice him. James Buchanan. He was the last president before the collapse, and he walked like a man trying not to wake the dead. James Buchanan didn't govern the country so much as loiter beside it, adjusting his cuffs while the walls trembled. He saw the fire coming. He knew where it would burn, but he was convinced, absolutely convinced, that if he moved carefully enough, maybe it wouldn't notice him. He was a lifelong bachelor, the only one to ever hold the presidency. He never married, never came close after the early heartbreak of a broken engagement. Instead, he developed routines, controlled his space, measured his interactions, and kept company with silence, and with Hermes. That was the name of his pet hermit crab, Hermes the Silent. It lived in a large glass bowl in his study. Nestled among tiny hand-carved furniture Buchanan had commissioned specifically for it, complete with a chaise lounge and a minuscule bookshelf. Empty, of course. He never referred to it as a pet, only as "my colleague." Staff weren't allowed to touch the bowl. It was said he sometimes held quiet conversations with it late at night, not out loud, just in thought. He had other obsessions too, sneezing, for example. Buchanan believed sneezing purged dishonesty from the room, not just for the one sneezing, but for everyone nearby. During tense meetings, if someone sneezed, Buchanan would pause the discussion and say, with absolute seriousness, "Let's begin again." The air has shifted. His cabinet learned to fake sneezes when desperate for a second chance. He wore a glass eye, not because he needed it. His vision, while declining, was sufficient, but as a psychological tool. He placed it over his left eye during especially tense meetings. The effect was deeply unsettling. The eye never blinked, never moved. Visitors left unsure which eye was real and which had just stared them into self-doubt. Buchanan said it rebalanced the gaze of negotiations. He was obsessed with balance. Not moral balance, not justice, just stillness. He rearranged furniture constantly, not because he liked change, but because he feared entropy. He believed desks should never face windows. It invited judgment from the outside. He had a custom-made pen holder that rotated with magnetic tension, designed to always return to center. He never used red ink, called it the color of conflict. He kept letters unopened for weeks, believing that decisions should age before being confronted. He delayed action on almost everything, convinced that overreaction was the true enemy of statesmanship. While the nation drifted towards secession, Buchanan wrote long letters to foreign dignitaries about trade policies, as if diverting his focus might divert fate. It didn't. By the end of his presidency, 11 states had declared their intention to leave the Union. Buchanan's response was complex, legalistic, and inert. He claimed secession was illegal, but that the federal government had no authority to stop it. It was the political equivalent of locking the front door and blaming the hinges for collapsing. When he left office, the country was already splintering. Lincoln, newly elected, inherited not a nation, but a battlefield. Buchanan, meanwhile, returned home to silence, to Hermes the Silent, to furniture aligned at 90-degree angles and stacks of newspapers folded with surgical precision. He never stopped defending himself. He wrote volumes in his own favor, public letters, private memoirs, clarifications, rebuttals, diagrams. He believed history would vindicate him, not as a man of action, but as a man of restraint, the one who didn't panic, the one who knew the rules. But the rules had changed, and history did not vindicate him. It mostly ignored him or blamed him. He is remembered now not for what he did, but for what he didn't do, for the moments when silence was not virtue, but void, and so he died, quietly, slowly, under heavy curtains and the judgment of time, a bachelor, a minimalist, a man who spoke to crabs and trusted sneezes more than people. And then came the man who could never quite stop speaking, the man who dreamed his own death before it arrived, the man with notes stuffed in his hat, with sadness behind his eyes, with jokes that hit like riddles from a dying prophet. His name was Abraham Lincoln, and he wasn't born into mystery, he built it, one sorrow at a time. Abraham Lincoln, he carried his presidency like a man hauling a coffin up a mountain, one deliberate step after another, never forgetting the weight. Abraham Lincoln was not born under a star. He was born under a leaking roof, in a one-room cabin in Kentucky, wrapped in rough wool and already too tall for the cradle. He grew like a question that refused to be answered, and by the time the country noticed him, it was already collapsing. Lincoln read everything. He devoured books the way other boys devoured bread, by firelight, in silence, in scraps. He read law without a teacher, poetry without commentary, scripture without piety. He preferred solitude. He preferred contradiction. He would weep at Shakespeare and laugh at executions. His humor wasn't light. It was dry and dark and, sharp enough to cut meat. And always, always, he carried his hat. It wasn't just a hat. It was his office, his filing cabinet, his traveling mind. Inside it were notes, speeches, letters, scraps of paper folded like secrets. Even indoors, even during war meetings, he kept it close. One aide joked that his hat held more policy than the treasury. He didn't laugh, because it was true. He was plagued by dreams, vivid, recurring ones. The most famous, a vision of the White House draped in mourning. In the dream, Lincoln walked the halls and asked, "Who is dead?" A voice answered, "The president." He woke, heart pounding, the image never leaving him. He told Mary. He told his cabinet. He even wrote it down. Weeks later, he was shot at Ford's Theater. But long before that bullet, Lincoln had already been dying in inches. He was rail thin, often sick, prone to melancholy. What they called melancholy then, we now call depression. Lincoln called it the dampness. It followed him. He wrote poems about death in his 20s. In letters, he spoke of a tiredness no rest can reach. He joked often, but rarely laughed. He told stories to ease the room, but his own air rarely lifted. He once pardoned a soldier for desertion because he said the boy had his mother's eyes. When a general objected, Lincoln replied, "I've seen too much blood. Let him go home." The boy lived. The war didn't end. He believed in omens. Not superstitiously, but personally. He watched birds for patterns. He stared at firewood for too long. He took long carriage rides without speaking, just thinking, just tracing the weight of the nation with his eyes. He didn't believe he'd survive his presidency. Not really. He once said, "If someone wants to kill me, there is nothing to prevent it. All they need is courage and a gun." When it finally happened, no one was surprised, saddened, shattered, but not surprised. He wore the same black suit for days. Often forgot to eat. His shoes were too big, his voice too thin, his hands constantly in motion. He greeted children like kings and generals like neighbors. He held no one at arm's length, but held everyone with caution. He understood people too well to trust them quickly. And yet, for all his sorrow, there was warmth, a deep, strange warmth. He remembered every name, every detail. He knew the names of the janitors in the War Department. He memorized the birthdays of his enemies. He sent handwritten notes to widows. He carried candy for soldiers too young to shave. He was not holy, he was not perfect, but he was good, in the truest, most exhausting sense of the word. And his presidency was agony. The Civil War cracked the country open. He stitched it back together with words, with patience, with a refusal to hate even those who deserved it. He lost his own son while leading a country full of grieving fathers. He visited hospitals, walked through blood, carried the dead in his speeches. He dreamed often. In one vision, he stood on a boat, moving steadily toward a shore he couldn't see. The water was calm, the air was still, but something waited, always. He recorded the dream in his journal, called it a message from the end. He never claimed to understand destiny, only to recognize when it called. And when it did, on April 14th, 1865, he was ready. He left behind a shattered country, a broken chair, and a ghost that would haunt the presidency forever. But even after death, the notes stayed, folded in hats, hidden in drawers, scribbled in margins, echoes of a man who joked through sorrow, governed through despair, and died in pursuit of unfinished business. The man who followed him inherited a country in mourning, and a seat still warm with sacrifice. He chewed tobacco like it was an argument. He once chased someone from his yard with a pitchfork, and he believed strongly in the restorative power of raw onions. His name was Andrew Johnson, and where Lincoln healed, Johnson scabbed. Andrew Johnson. He didn't climb to the presidency, he collided with it. A tailor by trade, born in a log cabin without schooling, Andrew Johnson patched coats long before he patched policy. He didn't read much. He never studied law. He taught himself to write by candlelight, tracing letters on scraps of cloth, and somehow, through sheer will and the unstable machinery of assassination, he became the 17th president of the United States. He followed Lincoln, and that was his curse. Where Lincoln was nuance, Johnson was impulse. Where Lincoln soothed, Johnson provoked. And where Lincoln offered healing, Johnson arrived with vinegar in his voice and a chip on his shoulder that could flatten a room. He wasn't supposed to be president. Even he knew that. He didn't want the job. On Inauguration Day, he was visibly drunk, slurring through his oath as vice president, giving a meandering, slurred speech that left spectators stunned into silence. The rumor was that he'd been self-medicating a recent illness. The truth likely was more familiar. Andrew Johnson was a man who never learned to speak without a fight in his throat. He chewed tobacco constantly, in meetings, in bed, while signing legislation. He kept spittoons in nearly every room of the White House and hit them with astonishing accuracy, even mid-sentence. One staffer wrote, "The president speaks as though punctuation were a target." His temper was legendary. He once chased a reporter off his lawn with a pitchfork. Another time, after hearing a neighbor complain about government overreach, he stood shirtless on his porch and shouted, "The only thing overreaching is your own laziness." Then he went back inside and continued sewing a tear in his trousers. Because yes, he still tailored. Even as president, Johnson was known to mend his own clothes. He distrusted tailors, believed most suits were overpriced and understitched. His sewing kit traveled with him along with a leather-bound copy of the Constitution, dog-eared and annotated in the margins with phrases like nonsense and finally some sense. He hated pretense, refused to wear formal evening wear, often greeted foreign dignitaries in threadbare shirt sleeves, collar undone, a streak of tobacco on his cuff. When criticized for it, he replied, "I never trusted a man with silk on his throat." And he loved onions. Raw, sliced, often eaten by hand like apples. He believed they cured congestion, calmed nerves, and, more controversially, prevented betrayal. He once told a general, "A man with onion breath is harder to lie to." No one understood the logic. Johnson didn't explain. He governed like a man settling personal scores. He vetoed Reconstruction bills with near religious fervor. He believed the Southern states had never really left the Union and deserved swift, unconditional reintegration. Congress, led by radical Republicans, disagreed. Furious, they overrode his vetoes, challenged his authority, and set the stage for what became the first impeachment of a U.S. president. He survived it by one vote, but the damage was permanent. Johnson became a symbol of obstruction, a man who walked into a ruined house and refused to pick up a broom unless someone apologized first. He didn't build coalitions. He barked demands. He saw compromise as weakness and principle as a mirror to shout into. His speeches, often delivered from staircases and porches, were part policy, part sermon, and part bar fight. He once referred to Congress as a gang of usurpers drunk on their own cowardice. The quote made headlines. Johnson didn't back down. He was not without conviction. He was a Southerner who remained loyal to the Union. That took courage. He loathed aristocracy, despised slavery, and came from poverty, so deep it clung to his voice for the rest of his life. But he wore his convictions like armor, and sometimes like weapons. The war had ended, but Johnson still looked for enemies in every direction. He distrusted laughter, believed jokes weakened authority. He surrounded himself with loyalists and dismissed critics with profanity. At night, he walked the White House halls in socks, muttering phrases from speeches never delivered. He wrote letters he never sent, kept a drawer full of them labeled justice. He did not run for re-election. Few expected him to. When he left office, there was no parade, no speeches, just a man with a sewing kit in his coat pocket, a half-eaten onion in his lunch tin, and a country still fractured behind him. He returned to Tennessee, ran for Senate, and won. The only former president to do so. There he gave one final speech warning about the dangers of forgetting who the real people are. Then he died of a stroke, alone in a stranger's house while traveling. They found his body with a copy of the Constitution folded under his pillow, and a note in his pocket that read, "The truth will wait, but not forever." The next president wouldn't have to wait for the truth. He'd been a general, a myth, a silent storm wrapped in uniform. He hated politics, hated talking, but he knew how to win. His name was Ulysses S. Grant, and he'd come to lead not with speeches, but with scars. Ulysses S. Grant. He didn't want to be president. He didn't even particularly want to be famous. Ulysses S. Grant would have been content with a quiet life. His horse, a pipe, a stack of memoirs to read, and not a single reporter in sight. But history doesn't wait for comfort. It demands sacrifice, then demands more. And Grant, as always, showed up anyway. He was a quiet man in a noisy century. Small, expressionless, almost disheveled. When he walked into a room, people often didn't realize who he was. And he liked it that way. He wasn't built for politics. He was built for endurance. He didn't talk much. When he did, it was slow, dry, and to the point. Aides joked he measured his words with calipers. He could express a whole paragraph with a shrug, one said, and a battlefield strategy with a sigh. He once ended a cabinet meeting by looking up from his cigar and saying, "I believe that's enough noise for today." It was. He smoked constantly. Not casually, religiously. Grant burned through more than 20 cigars a day. During the Civil War, supporters sent him boxes by the thousands. His breath smelled like ash and victory. His fingers were permanently stained. And yet, he smoked not for image, but because it gave his nerves something to do. The silence within him was vast. Tobacco filled the edges. He didn't believe in luck. He believed in readiness. He rose early, rode hard, and rarely celebrated. When asked why he never smiled in portraits, he replied, "I don't pose for praise." His suits were often wrinkled, his boots muddy. He hated formal dinners and could never remember which fork was for fish, but he could recall with perfect clarity the position of every regiment under his command at Shiloh. His memory for war was not romantic. It was surgical. He didn't glorify the battlefield, he endured it. And when people called him a butcher, he didn't argue. "I make war," he said. Not excuses. His presidency, however, was less precise. Grant approached the White House the way a soldier approaches unfamiliar terrain, with caution and hope it wouldn't explode underfoot. He trusted people too easily, delegated too often, and surrounded himself with the men who smiled well but handled power like broken glass. Scandal dripped from his administration like tar, thick and difficult to scrape off. Grant himself remained untouched, but never unaware. He once said, "I'm a verb. Everything happens around me." Still, he fought for civil rights when few others dared. He crushed the Ku Klux Klan with federal troops. He signed legislation that would later become the blueprint for the Justice Department. He didn't always know how to speak justice, but he acted it clumsily, relentlessly. He believed in Reconstruction long after the country was eager to forget it. And behind the policies, the cigars, and the reputation, there were strange quirks, small rituals of a man who carried ghosts. He was obsessed with horses, not just as animals, but as creatures of almost spiritual discipline. He could break a wild stallion with a whisper. He rarely raised his voice. But if a horse bucked, Grant would simply wait, calm as stone, until the animal remembered who he was. He hated blood. Despite being one of the most effective generals in history, he turned his eyes away during surgery. He couldn't stomach the sight of meat being butchered. He ate simply toast, beans, sometimes a sliver of beef drowned in horseradish. He was afraid of financial ruin. After leaving the presidency, he trusted a friend with his life savings, only to be swindled, bankrupted, humiliated. So he began writing. Every day, in pain, with cancer crawling through his throat. He wrote because it was the only thing left to give his family a future. He finished his memoirs just days before his death. The book would become one of the most lauded in American letters, clear, concise, and astonishingly honest. He died quietly, surrounded by trees, wrapped in a blanket, his cigar finally out. Ulysses S. Grant didn't want monuments. He didn't want legends. He wanted peace. And if not that, at least silence. The man who followed him didn't believe in silence. He talked to himself in mirrors. He gave odd, rambling speeches. He once debated a rooster in front of his staff. His name was Rutherford B. Hayes, and for a man who won the presidency by one electoral vote, he governed like someone trying to earn it back, one awkward minute at a time. Rutherford B. Hayes. He won the presidency without actually winning the election, or at least not winning it the usual way. Rutherford B. Hayes emerged from a constitutional crisis, a contested vote count, and a backroom deal so murky it still smells like cigar smoke and desperation. His opponent, Samuel Tilden, won the popular vote. Hayes took the White House by a single electoral vote, thanks to what became known as the Compromise of 1877. He was called his fraudulency before he even unpacked. And yet he governed with the earnest energy of a man trying to deserve it anyway. Hayes didn't mind the nickname, not publicly. Privately, he kept a diary. In it, he recorded everything: meetings, observations, and his emotional temperature, calibrated almost hourly. He gave himself grades, judged his own posture. He once wrote, "Stood too long near Grant's statue. Felt like an imitation." He believed in routine with near spiritual intensity. He woke at dawn, washed in cold water, wrote longhand letters every morning, sometimes to real people, sometimes to abstractions. He kept a mirror on his desk, and occasionally, when decisions grew difficult, he'd stare into it and whisper both sides of the argument aloud. He believed you couldn't lie to yourself if you saw your own face doing it. He had a rooster named Napoleon who patrolled the White House lawn. Hayes once interrupted a meeting to shout at the bird for crowing during a discussion of the gold standard. When someone laughed, he said, "That bird understands inflation better than Congress." No one laughed after that. He banned alcohol from the White House, not because of personal conviction. He occasionally drank wine in private, but because his wife, Lucy, was a teetotaler. She became known as Lemonade Lucy. Guests were served punchless punch, and state dinners tasted faintly of moral compromise. Hayes's private rebellion? He kept a bottle of brandy behind a false book spine labeled "Temperance and Other Lies." Despite his straight-laced image, Hayes could be oddly theatrical. He loved gadgets. Early telephones, gramophones, electric bells. He had a servant ring system wired into the residence and tested it himself by playing both servant and master. He would press a button, wait, and then enter from the hallway and answer his own call. He said it helped him understand the mechanics of service. He hated long speeches, but he gave them anyway. Long, rambling, often philosophical addresses that drifted from economics to poetry to infrastructure. Once in a speech about tariffs, he suddenly veered into a meditation on clouds. They gather, drift, and dissipate like public opinion. He was a reformer by instinct and an idealist by affliction. He wanted civil service appointments to be based on merit, not patronage. He believed the South needed reconciliation, but not at the cost of justice. He ended Reconstruction, officially, by withdrawing federal troops from the South, fulfilling the terms of the backroom deal that gave him the office. He hated the decision, but he followed through, and it haunted him. He carried a pocket watch he never wound. It was a gift, and he said he preferred it that way. Some time should remain frozen, he once explained. He was afraid of dentists and never sat still during appointments. One particularly unlucky dentist reported Hayes talked through the entire procedure, including his own scream. When asked how he found the experience, Hayes replied, "More civil than Congress." He wrote poetry no one was allowed to read. He labeled one drawer, "Unsent Apologies." Inside were letters never mailed, to former rivals, to cabinet members, to the rooster, each one carefully folded, each one signed. He only served one term, declined to run again, said the office ought to be a relay, not a throne. After leaving the presidency, he worked for prison reform, education access, and Veterans Affairs. He gave speeches in schoolhouses and sat on folding chairs. He never wore a top hat again, claimed it made him feel like a silhouette. He died in 1893, quietly, while writing a letter to his grandchildren. On his desk, an open journal, a dried flower, and a line of poetry he'd copied the day before. The noise fades, but the walk must go on. And then came a man who wouldn't walk quietly at all. He had the bulk of a blacksmith, the mustache of a train robber, and the political subtlety of a canon in a church. His name was James A. Garfield, and he would write ambidextrously in 2 languages while giving speeches with his eyes closed. James A. Garfield. He could write in Latin with one hand and Greek with the other, simultaneously. James A. Garfield wasn't just intelligent, he was overwhelming. A prodigy disguised as a Civil War general, a preacher who became a professor, who became a politician, who never quite wanted to be any of those things. He wore genius like a burden and spoke with the quiet intensity of someone who always had a better metaphor in his back pocket. And he didn't even want the presidency. The Republican convention of 1880 deadlocked for 35 ballots. Garfield arrived only to support another candidate. He left as the nominee. When told he'd been chosen, he collapsed into a chair and whispered, "This honor comes unsought." He didn't smile. He didn't cheer. He wrote in his diary, "I am too astonished to speak, too deeply agitated to feel." Then he got to work. He read obsessively, 5 books at a time, stacked like artillery. History, astronomy, theology, mathematics. His mind didn't have breaks. His study was full of open books, marked with stones instead of bookmarks. He said paper clips made the pages feel trapped. He believed books should breathe. Garfield talked in layers. He would begin a sentence about tariffs, detour into a Shakespeare quote, return via an anecdote about cicadas, and finish with a stump-splitting policy proposal. Crowds loved it, or pretended to. When asked about his style, Garfield replied, "Truth prefers a winding path. It lets the lazy fall behind." He sleepwalked through speeches. Not metaphorically, literally. Sometimes he would stand up in the middle of the night and begin reciting addresses, half dreaming, half remembering. His wife, Lucretia, once found him at 2 a.m. in the hallway, debating an imaginary senator over postal reform. She listened for 5 minutes, then went back to bed. He kept maps of stars on his wall and called them legislative goals. He carried pebbles in his coat pocket, 5 of them polished smooth. Each represented a principle. When making a difficult decision, he would turn them in his hand like worry stones. He never told anyone which was which, and yet, for all his abstraction, Garfield had a physical presence. He had the chest of a lumberjack and a voice that could rattle windows. He hated formal wear, preferred loose vests and wool socks. He trimmed his own beard, believing barbers were philosophers in disguise and prone to distraction. His hair was always slightly uneven. He said it reminded him that perfection was a trap. He loved Sundays, not for rest, but for silence. He read scripture and geometry back to back. He believed both revealed divine symmetry. His presidency was short, truncated by madness. On July 2nd, 1881, 4 months into his term, he was shot in a Washington train station by Charles Guiteau, a deranged office seeker convinced that Garfield owed him a job. Garfield didn't die right away. He lingered for 80 days. 80 days of agony, of doctors probing with unwashed hands, of experimental treatments and hopeful telegrams. The bullet couldn't be found. X-rays hadn't been invented. Alexander Graham Bell tried to locate the slug with a metal detector of his own design. It didn't work, but Garfield didn't complain. Not once. His letters from bed remained poetic, philosophical. He wrote to his children, to his cabinet, to Lucretia. He tried to govern from his sick room between convulsions and fevers. My country, he wrote, has not left me. He lost over 80 pounds. His spine curved. His voice thinned. He could no longer lift the pebbles in his pocket. They remained in a dish beside his bed. He died on September 19th, 1881. In his desk, they found a sheet of paper with a single line written in precise cursive. I still have work in my head. And so ended a presidency more imagined than realized. A mind built for 10,000 problems silenced by one absurd act of delusion and bad medicine. And into that vacancy stepped a man no one expected to lead. He owned over 80 pairs of pants, changed outfits 5 times a day, had mutton chops that deserved their own zip code, and was once described as a gentleman of furniture. His name was Chester A. Arthur, and he entered the White House like he'd walked into a drawing room and decided to stay. Chester A. Arthur. He arrived at the White House dressed like an after-dinner guest who had just been asked to run a country. Chester A. Arthur, the machine politician from New York, the connoisseur of waistcoats, the man once dismissed as nothing but a fancy man with a mustache and a good tailor, suddenly found himself in charge of a grieving nation. Nobody expected greatness, not even him, but he brought trunks full of clothes. Arthur owned over 80 pairs of pants, silk-lined, wool-blended, seasonally rotated. He had separate wardrobes for morning, afternoon, and evening. He once said, "I may be president, but I am not a savage." He wore a fresh flower on his lapel daily. His mustache was combed, his hair pomaded, his cuffs starched to weapon-grade stiffness. And yet, underneath the brocade and linen, there was a man far stranger and far sadder than the press ever understood. He redecorated the White House not for vanity, but because he couldn't stand its echoes. The rooms, still heavy with Garfield's silence, unsettled him. He hired Louis Tiffany, yes, that Tiffany, to design stained glass windows, gilded walls, and bespoke gaslight fixtures. The East Room, once a somber chamber of state, now shimmered like an upscale parlor. Some said it was vulgar. Arthur said only, "We must live with grace," or not at all. He also ordered 24 wagon loads of old furniture burned on the south lawn. Desks, sofas, drapes. When asked why, he replied, "The past must not smell." He was nocturnal, rarely rose before 10 a.m., conducted business in the afternoon, hosted salons well into the night. He drank champagne from crystal flutes and debated tariffs under gaslight chandeliers. He preferred meetings by lamplight and often paced barefoot in silk robes while discussing civil service reform. Because yes, he pushed reform hard. The man once branded a political hack, the spoilsman, became a champion of merit. He signed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, stunning both allies and enemies. He turned against the very patronage system that had elevated him. "I may be president," he said, "but I am also responsible." He didn't give speeches unless absolutely necessary. He spoke quietly with unnerving precision. He once ended a reporter's question by simply staring. The journalist left, apologizing for intruding. Arthur later said, "Silence is the only reply they understand." But he was also deeply sentimental. He kept a locked drawer in the presidential desk filled with letters to his late wife, Ellen. She had died just before he became vice president. He never stopped writing to her. Even in the White House, even surrounded by brocade and brass, he wrote her notes in the middle of the night and folded them into envelopes he never mailed. He kept her portrait above the fireplace. When no one was around, he'd speak to it. He also maintained peculiar habits. He measured the temperature of his tea with a thermometer, refused to eat green grapes, calling them fruit caught mid-thought. He had a fear of ceiling cracks, believed they invited ghosts, instructed his staff to repaint rooms at the first sign of one. He collected walking sticks, but rarely used them. Each was carved with a phrase, some personal, some biblical, some pure nonsense like, "Resist the mundane," or "Today deserves better shoes." He carried a monogrammed handkerchief dipped in lavender oil and refused to sign documents with black ink. It ends the sentence too severely, he said. Instead, he used brown, or on solemn occasions, blue. He also suffered. Quietly, Arthur had Bright's disease, a terminal kidney condition. He kept it hidden. Only his doctor and a few confidants knew. He didn't want pity. He wanted dignity. He knew he wouldn't live long. So he governed like a man trying to make peace with his record. He chose not to seek re-election. Instead, he returned to private life, declined all offers of memoirs, said, "I leave that to the men who need to explain themselves." He died 2 years later, alone, quietly, as was his style. Among his personal effects, a pocket watch stopped at 3:15, several notes to Ellen, and a pair of blue gloves labeled for final appearances. The man who followed him had none of Arthur's polish. He was a preacher, a teacher, and a man who once chased down a pickpocket himself while in office. He hated pomp, feared failure, and carried in his coat a letter from his dead mother telling him to stay humble. His name was Grover Cleveland, and he would become president. Then not. Then again, Grover Cleveland. He entered the White House like a man checking into a job he never asked for. Grover Cleveland was not charismatic. He was not eloquent. He didn't tell stories or kiss babies or pose beside flags with a winning grin. He carried the demeanor of a weary accountant, handed a national ledger and told, "Fix it." And in his own quietly bulldozing way, he tried. He weighed over 250 pounds. His mustache arrived a few seconds before the rest of him. He spoke slowly, plainly, with all the flourish of a bailiff reading charges. He hated small talk, distrusted charm, and approached the presidency with the moral fervor of a man hired to clean up someone else's bar tab. He once said, "Public office is a public trust." He said it so often it became a slogan, then a warning, then a dare. Cleveland didn't ask for forgiveness. He asked for receipts. He was a bachelor when first elected, only the second in U.S. history, but that didn't stop the scandal. During his campaign, news broke that he had fathered a child out of wedlock years earlier. His response? Tell the truth. His opponents shouted, "Ma, Ma, where's my pa?" His supporters responded after he won, "Gone to the White House, ha ha ha." Scandal didn't stick to Cleveland. It bounced off his unflinching monotone. He married in the White House, the only president to do so. His bride, Frances Folsom, was 21. He was 49. He had known her since she was a baby. He'd even bought her baby carriage. The arrangement, by today's standards, raises eyebrows. By his, it raised expectations. The press called it romantic. Cleveland didn't smile much. But when he spoke about Frances, he softened slightly. He worked long hours, refused to delegate, personally reviewed pension applications by the hundreds. He vetoed more bills than all previous presidents combined. He wielded the veto pen like a scalpel, carving bloat and favoritism from legislation with near-surgical disdain. He once said, "I trust Congress to do the wrong thing when left unsupervised." He hated ceremonial nonsense. In one parade, he left halfway through, mumbling something about needing to check on tariff data. He banned unnecessary decorations in his office. He allowed exactly one portrait to hang, Thomas Jefferson. When asked why, he replied, he knew the difference between liberty and license. He had habits that bordered on compulsive. He cracked his knuckles before every cabinet meeting, always twice on the left hand, once on the right. He kept a jar of mustard seeds in his desk, believing they aided digestion and clarity. He slept with a window open year-round, even in winter, claiming that fresh air freezes dishonesty. He hated mirrors, not for superstition, for distraction. They make men self-aware when they should be selfless, he said. He shaved by memory. He liked fishing, obsessively. He could sit for hours on a boat without speaking. He said the silence of water was as close to governance as nature gets. He once canceled a press conference to chase trout in the Adirondacks. Reporters were furious. Cleveland replied with a telegram. Fish required less bait than Congress. Then he lost re-election. Benjamin Harrison beat him by securing the electoral vote. Though Cleveland won the popular vote, Cleveland packed his things, left peacefully, didn't complain, didn't scheme, just left. But he wasn't finished. 4 years later, he came back. Won again. The only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. When asked why he returned, he said, because the work wasn't done. His second term was harder. The country was in economic freefall. Banks collapsed. Unemployment soared. He received letters soaked in tears and ink, begging for help. He read everyone. He also had cancer, a lesion in his mouth. He had it removed in secret, aboard a yacht, under cover of a fake fishing trip. The surgery was done through the roof of his mouth. He lost part of his jaw. A prosthetic was fitted. He kept talking. No one knew for years. He recovered, finished his term, and walked away again. No fanfare, no parade, just a quiet return to Buffalo. He spent his days writing letters, scowling at bad syntax, and warning young politicians against their own ambitions. He died in 1908. Among his final words, "I have tried so hard to do right." Then came a man who would march into the White House with a full brass band, write speeches in the margins of dinner menus, and treat international tariffs like personal insults. He was small in stature, but not in pride. His name was Benjamin Harrison, and he governed like a man allergic to dust and desperately trying to keep the curtains from catching fire. Benjamin Harrison. He was 5 feet 6 inches tall and absolutely determined not to be overlooked. Benjamin Harrison, grandson of the shortest serving president in U.S. history, walked into the White House like a man trying to set a family record for sheer volume. If Grover Cleveland had been a ledger book with legs, Harrison was an index card on fire. Compact, detailed, and alarmingly flammable. He had the bearing of a Sunday school teacher and the policy instincts of a locomotive. He spoke in long, winding sentences with tight little traps of wit hidden inside. He wore stiff collars so high they left red marks on his neck. He once said, "A man's collar ought to remind him of his limitations. His never let him forget." Harrison hated dirt, not metaphorically, literally. He had White House staff scrub the baseboards daily and requested new spittoons every week, not because the old ones were worn out, but because they felt morally fatigued. He believed dust was the enemy of civilization. During dry spells, he had the White House lawn watered twice a day, not for the grass, but to keep particles from entering his office through the windows. He didn't like shaking hands. Called it a crude exchange of skin oils. During public receptions, he limited himself to 2 finger touches and brief nods. Visitors often left confused, wondering if they'd just been blessed or dismissed. He was meticulous. When reading bills, he would annotate them in multiple colors. Blue for constitutional concerns, red for moral objections, and green for economic impact. He once returned a 400-page report to Congress with 117 margin notes and a cover memo titled "A Modest Attempt at Clarity," and yet he was surprisingly superstitious. He kept a rabbit's foot in his coat pocket, anonymously gifted by a Civil War veteran. He refused to sit at a table with exactly 13 guests. He avoided entering rooms leftward. His diary contains the phrase "bad air today" over a dozen times, with no further explanation. He was obsessed with electricity. His administration oversaw the electrification of the White House, an innovation he championed but privately feared. He refused to touch the light switches. He was convinced he'd be electrocuted. Staff had to operate them for him. Guests noted that at night the White House sometimes glowed like a lighthouse with no keeper. He was a brilliant orator, but never warmed a room. People respected his intellect, not his company. He gave long speeches filled with metaphors and theological asides. He quoted Latin in casual conversation and expected everyone else to keep up. At dinners, he would pause mid-bite to correct someone's grammar or rephrase their opinion, not maliciously, just methodically. He also gave more speeches than any president before him. He traveled more, spoke faster, printed more federal documents, hired more clerks. He believed in information as a weapon against chaos. His administration produced so much paperwork, Congress had to purchase new shelving for the archives. Harrison called it evidence of order, but he was not without contradiction. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, a landmark bill meant to regulate corporate monopolies, but he also oversaw tariffs so high they ballooned federal surpluses into national debate. The McKinley tariff, championed under his watch, made imported goods prohibitively expensive. Harrison said it was for American jobs. His critics said it was for American egos. Both were half right. He had no patience for performative populism. He believed virtue lived in detail. He wrote his own speeches, drafted his own letters, and once fired a cabinet secretary for using too many exclamation marks. He also played the violin, badly, not for an audience, just for himself. often at night. Staff reported hearing the thin wail of bowstrings through the halls, mournful and slow, like a song trying to remember its melody. His relationship with Frances Cleveland, the former First Lady and now the current First Lady again, was cordial. They attended the same functions, exchanged polite greetings, but the air between the Harrison and Cleveland administrations remained thick with competition. Harrison once said of Cleveland, "He left the place tidy but not prepared." Cleveland later returned the favor with, "He dusted the drapes and burned the furniture." Harrison ran for re-election in 1892 and lost. Grover Cleveland returned, the only man to serve non-consecutive terms. The voters had made their preference known. Again, Harrison's wife, Caroline, died during the campaign. He continued campaigning anyway, not out of ambition, but out of duty. After his defeat, he returned home, wrote a book, gave lectures, played violin to nobody. He died in 1901, just months before another president would be gunned down in Buffalo. His funeral was well attended, though no orchestra played. Only silence, polished shoes, and a folded collar pressed too tight. William McKinley, he wore a red carnation in his lapel, every day, without fail. It wasn't for decoration, it was for protection. William McKinley believed the flower brought him luck, clarity, maybe even survival. He called it his sentinel bloom. He would pause meetings to repin it if it drooped. If it wilted, the day stopped until a fresh one arrived. And it did keep him safe, until the day it didn't. On September 6th, 1901, he handed his flower to a young girl in a receiving line. Minutes later, he was shot. Twice. The carnation was gone. The luck, perhaps, with it. McKinley was not a loud man. He didn't thunder. He didn't pound podiums or shake his fist. He governed like a gentleman managing a particularly tense dinner party. Soft voice, polite tone, steel spine. He was deliberate, charming in a measured way, and eerily composed, a man who could give bad news with the grace of a eulogy and make it feel like a weather report. He believed in process, in patience, in keeping one's shoes shined even during war. But beneath the calm exterior was a man carrying more superstition than his party platform ever revealed. He never traveled without his monogrammed silver pepper shaker, not salt, only pepper. He kept it in a felt-lined case and brought it to every meal. Banquets, campaign stops, train rides. He believed pepper sharpened decision-making, cleared the senses. He would pause mid-bite, unscrew the lid, tap 3 precise shakes, and nod before continuing. No one challenged it. No one asked. It became part of the ritual of McKinley. Like the carnation, like the silence before a speech, he was not prone to regret in public, but in private, he kept a small leather-bound notebook titled "When I Almost Said No." Inside, he documented moments of reluctant assent, political compromises, appointments he questioned, policies signed under pressure. The entries were brief, just a sentence or two, but carried an emotional charge far heavier than his public persona ever allowed. Agreed to a tariff adjustment despite internal doubts. Accepted dinner invitation I knew would corner me. Said yes to the second speech when one was enough. The notebook never left his desk. It wasn't about politics. It was about thresholds. McKinley hated confrontation, but wasn't weak. He led the country into the Spanish-American War with grim necessity, not fanfare. He believed in expansion, not for empire, he claimed, but for duty. Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico. He saw America as a stabilizer, a steward. Critics saw something else. The rise of imperial ambition cloaked in handshakes. His speeches were restrained. He preferred to talk slowly, with long pauses, giving the listener space to meet him halfway. He rarely smiled on cue, and when he did, it looked like it had traveled a long distance to arrive. He once told an aide, "A smile must be honest, or it is theft." He was married to Ida, a woman frail in body but fiercely loyal. She suffered from seizures and deep grief over the deaths of their 2 young daughters. McKinley adjusted his entire schedule around her needs. At public events, if she felt overwhelmed, he would reach under the table and quietly hold her hand until the moment passed. He never let the country see her falter. He read poetry but rarely quoted it, kept a handkerchief folded into the shape of a rose, played the zither, but only in private, hummed while pacing, recited facts in threes, dates, names, locations, as if keeping order would hold the chaos at bay. He distrusted elevators, said they rushed the mind upward before it's ready, preferred stairs. Took them slowly, counting aloud, and then, in his second term, he began to feel something shift. He grew more introspective, slower to sign, more likely to pause mid-sentence and rub his thumb across his lapel flower. Some thought he was tired. Others thought he had begun to see what the presidency took, not in scandal, not in mistakes, but in inches, in agreements, in nods, in the subtle erosion of will. At the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, the mood was celebratory. McKinley stood in a receiving line, shaking hands, smiling politely, carnation pinned to his chest. A man approached, wrapped in bandages, concealing a pistol. The president didn't flinch. He leaned forward. 2 shots. 1 in the chest, 1 in the abdomen. Even then, McKinley tried to calm the crowd. Let no one hurt him, he said of his assassin. He didn't know what he was doing. He lingered for over a week, fading slowly, politely, painfully. Doctors assured the nation he was recovering. He wasn't. Infection spread. The bullet couldn't be found. His final words were a whisper, "It is God's way. His will be done." And just like that, the quiet man with the pepper shaker and the red carnation was gone. But his death didn't bring silence. It brought thunder. Because the man who stepped into the presidency wasn't quiet. He boxed in the White House, kept a bear cub as a pet, wrote a speech, took a bullet, and finished the speech anyway. His name was Theodore Roosevelt. And the modern presidency was about to be kicked in the teeth, with perfect posture. Theodore Roosevelt. He came in like a gunshot through velvet curtains. One moment, William McKinley was whispering his final prayer. The next, Theodore Roosevelt had taken the oath of office in a dark suit that still smelled faintly of pine and gunpowder. He was 42, young enough to be everyone's son, loud enough to be everyone's father, and convinced, without irony, that he was the most interesting man who had ever held the job. He did not move quietly. He didn't tiptoe into the presidency. He kicked the door off the hinges and rode in on horseback, literally. He boxed in the White House, sparred with naval officers, took blows to the head that left him partially blind in one eye, then refused to stop. He climbed mountains during policy debates, rode his horse at full gallop through Rock Creek Park before breakfast, gave press conferences with a falcon perched on his wrist. He once interrupted a cabinet meeting to identify a bird outside the window. "Warbler," he said, then resumed planning the Panama Canal. The White House changed under him. Rooms that once whispered now roared. Children galloped down marble hallways. Roosters crowed from the lawn. Reporters were given nicknames and told to try and keep up. Furniture was rearranged constantly because Roosevelt believed in active interiors. He ate like a soldier, talked like a preacher, laughed like a man on fire. But beneath all the motion was method. He read 1 book per day, on average, while president, memorized passages, annotated margins. His reading desk had 4 lamps, 3 notepads, and a drawer labeled Urgent Philosophy. He wrote letters compulsively, long ones, some over 20 pages, most filled with underlines and exclamation points that looked like military salutes. He believed in big stick diplomacy. Speak softly, yes, but swing like hell. He sent the Great White Fleet around the world just to show other nations that America owned both ink and iron. When criticized for warmongering, he shrugged and said, "I simply believe in being prepared to win." He kept a menagerie, snakes, parrots, bears, a badger named Josiah who once bit a congressman. He loved animals, but only the honest ones. He called cats deceivers. He distrusted chameleons, gave speeches about wolves, said they reminded him of lobbyists. He was a contradiction in boots. Progressive, yet imperial. Elitist, yet wildly popular. A champion of conservation who shot everything in sight. He saved more land than any president before him. Over 230 million acres, but only after hunting it first. His logic: you cannot truly protect what you haven't confronted. He ate raw onions like apples, believed they kept his voice sharp. He delivered 3-hour speeches with no water, then rode 15 miles on horseback. Once, while campaigning in Milwaukee, he was shot in the chest. The bullet lodged near his ribs, stopped by a folded speech and his metal glasses case. He insisted on finishing the speech. Bleeding, wheezing, holding his side, he told the crowd, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." The phrase stuck. So did the bullet. He kept it there for life. Roosevelt's energy wasn't enthusiasm. It was volcanic pressure. He once said that if he didn't keep moving, he would explode. He reformed the civil service, took on monopolies, built up the Navy, threatened coal barons with federal seizure. He made the presidency a moral pulpit, a legislative battering ram, a media spectacle, and a personal brand. Long before any of those terms had names, he did not believe in moderation. He invited Booker T. Washington to dinner and faced national outrage. He never apologized. He called critics timid souls who neither enjoy much nor suffer much. He kept enemies close and friends under pressure. He hated being bored. He said boredom was the same as cowardice. He read war memoirs during storms, rode in silence through national parks, labeled maps with words like sacred and still to conquer. He didn't run for re-election immediately. Honored tradition, handed the keys to William Howard Taft, then watched, horrified, as Taft moved the furniture. Roosevelt came back, tried to retake the presidency in 1912, formed the Bull Moose Party, campaigned like a man trying to outrun time, lost, but only just. When asked what he regretted, he said that I was born to read about heroism instead of live it. In his final years, he slowed, but only in distance, never in direction. He died in his sleep in 1919. A friend said, "The old lion is dead," but America had already become his jungle. And in the silence that followed, a much quieter man took center stage. He was large, gentle, cautious. He once got stuck in a White House bathtub and had it replaced with one big enough for 4 men. His name was William Howard Taft, and where Roosevelt stomped, Taft sloshed. William Howard Taft. He didn't want to be president, not really. William Howard Taft dreamed not of Oval Offices or parades, but of benches, robes, and long, thoughtful arguments about constitutional nuance. He wanted the Supreme Court. What he got instead was the White House and a chair that creaked every time he sat in it. He was the heaviest man to ever hold the office, topping 300 pounds, though that's not what truly weighed on him. It was expectation. He followed Theodore Roosevelt, the political steam engine, the human exclamation point. Taft, by contrast, was a semicolon in a room full of brass bands. He didn't move fast. He didn't speak in sparks. He preferred caution, deliberation, and breakfast large enough to terrify a modern cardiologist. Each morning began with steak, eggs, potatoes, toast, pancakes, hot chocolate, and sometimes pie. He called it priming the engine. His doctor called it a career hazard. Taft didn't care. He said a hungry man couldn't focus on justice, and justice was what he cared about. The law, the structure of things, the elegant logic of governance. He kept Supreme Court decisions beside his bed, annotated legal dictionaries in his study, and wrote letters to judges with more affection than he gave to most politicians. He once said, "The presidency is the loneliest place for a man who prefers precedent over personality." He hated conflict deeply. His worst moments were confrontational, his best ones administrative. He reformed civil service, streamlined the post office, expanded antitrust enforcement, but no one remembers that. They remember the bathtub. Let's talk about it. Taft, according to legend and some compelling plumbing records, once became stuck in a White House bathtub. It took multiple aides to extract him. The story spiraled from there. Did they use butter? A winch? A prayer? Taft himself never confirmed it, but afterward he did install a custom tub. It was 7 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, and could fit 4 grown men. Photographs of the tub exist. So does a note in his handwriting. Comfort is a condition of clarity. He was methodical in ways that bordered on obsessive. He kept a journal with 2 columns. Things I meant to say and things I actually said. He was often disappointed by the gap. He wore spats to avoid emotional laces. He hated being rushed, saying it made his thoughts sweat. He once delayed a cabinet meeting because the wind knocked a tree branch into a symmetry. He ordered it trimmed before proceeding. He snored so loudly that guests in the residence often heard him through 2 walls. He refused to apologize. He claimed it was the sound of honest digestion. Taft's relationship with Roosevelt, once warm, turned cold. Roosevelt had handpicked him, then turned on him, furiously, publicly. He accused Taft of betraying reform, of lacking spirit, of being too soft to carry the banner of progress. The two men, once friends, became rivals. Their 1912 showdown split the Republican Party in half and handed the presidency to Woodrow Wilson. Taft lost badly. He was relieved. He left office not in disgrace, but in exhaustion, and then at long last, he returned to the life he wanted. In 1921, President Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the United States. His real dream finally realized. Taft was the only man in history to lead both the executive and judicial branches, and he was brilliant at it. He modernized the court, reduced its backlog, wrote elegant opinions, worked until the end, robe pressed, mind sharp, appetite intact. He died in 1930. His last words, reportedly, "I'm glad I've done this." Today, most remember the bathtub. Few remember the jurisprudence. But Taft didn't mind. He once wrote, "History chews loudly and swallows slowly. Let it." And after the bathtub came a schoolteacher in mourning, a man who saw the world through moral instruction and silent suffering. He walked into the presidency already haunted. His name was Woodrow Wilson, and he governed like the world was a lecture hall, and God was grading on a curve. Woodrow Wilson. He entered the presidency like a professor called up to discipline the class. Woodrow Wilson, glasses sharp, posture rigid, gaze fixed on the horizon like he was reading invisible footnotes, didn't just think he was the smartest man in the room. He often was. And that was the problem. He spoke like a textbook, come to life. Not just fluent in the language of law and liberty, but fluent in the tone of importance. He didn't smile easily. He didn't crack jokes. His presence wasn't warm. It was clarifying. He could flay a political opponent with a paragraph and end a conversation with a parenthetical remark. He believed deeply in ideas, almost exclusively in ideas. People were messy. Institutions could be adjusted. But principles? Principles were sacred. He began each day with prayer, a hard-boiled egg, and a list. The list was non-negotiable. Goals, objectives, categories, subcategories. He believed a presidency without structure was like a sentence without punctuation. Dangerous. Every room he worked in had a desk facing due east. Every pen he used had to be uncapped in the left hand and turned twice before writing. His handwriting was immaculate. He wore starched collars that left red indentations on his neck. He believed comfort weakened conviction. He once said, "A man too relaxed forgets why he stood up in the first place," and he was always standing up for something. Progressive reform, antitrust laws, the Federal Reserve, the income tax, labor rights. Wilson's first term was a whirlwind of transformation. He was relentless, methodical, entirely convinced of his own moral clarity. He believed America wasn't just a country. It was a thesis, and he was its editor-in-chief. But behind the intellect was grief. His wife, Ellen, died in 1914. Her death gutted him. He withdrew, stopped writing letters, stopped making jokes, as rare as they were. He wandered the White House halls at night, sometimes barefoot, sometimes fully dressed, reading aloud from the Psalms. Staff heard him whisper, "Why this lesson?" On more than one occasion. He remarried quickly. Edith Galt, a widow with a steel in her spine and a face that never flinched. The courtship was fast, the marriage quiet. But Edith became more than a partner. She became a gatekeeper. Then the world fell apart. World War I tore through Europe. Wilson tried to keep America out of it. He preached neutrality, balance, moral detachment. But war is louder than sermons. When German submarines killed Americans, when alliances pulled taut, when headlines screamed louder than hymns, Wilson broke. He asked for war with a theologian's gravity. He called it the war to end all wars. He called it a fight to make the world safe for democracy. And people believed him, or wanted to. He led with words, gave speeches like scripture. His 14 points became a kind of political gospel. He traveled to Paris for peace negotiations, the first president to leave the country while in office. He was received like a prophet. Crowds shouted his name. He spoke of a League of Nations, a global body that would prevent future wars. He believed it would work, not hoped, believed. Back home, the Senate disagreed. They tore his dream apart piece by piece. Wilson, furious, refused to compromise. The League was rejected, his vision, so carefully constructed, shattered, and then his body followed. In October 1919, Wilson suffered a massive stroke. He became paralyzed on one side. His speech slurred, his mind clouded, and the public was not told. For months, the presidency was quietly run by Edith. She screened visitors, edited memos, guided policy. Historians still debate how much she influenced, but there's no debate that for nearly a year, the American president was functionally incapacitated, and his wife was the only one allowed near the controls. Wilson never fully recovered. He wore his weakness like a coat no one was allowed to acknowledge. He continued to write, to speak, to believe, but the power was gone, the clarity dimmed. He left office bitter, broken, still convinced that history would catch up to his ideals, that the League of Nations would someday rise, that the world would apologize for not listening. He died in 1924, quietly, in his Washington home. On his bedside table, a Bible, a copy of parliamentary procedure, and a page torn from his own speech. The world must be made safe for democracy. Warren G. Harding, he looked like a president. That was the beginning of the problem. Warren G. Harding had the jawline, the hair, the voice, deep, confident, radio ready. He walked like a campaign poster in motion, and when the country, exhausted from war and wilting under the moral weight of Woodrow Wilson, went looking for something, anything, easier, Harding offered them exactly that. He promised a return to normalcy. The word didn't exist. He made it up. People mocked it. Then they voted for it, by the millions. Harding didn't enter the White House with a vision. He entered with a sigh. He hated confrontation, loved poker, preferred compromise, laughter, backroom deals, and backhanded compliments. He governed like a man trying to keep the party going just a little longer, smiling, smoothing, folding bad hands, bluffing through press conferences. He once lost the White House china set in a poker game, not metaphorically, literally, during one of the many smoke-thick card nights with his inner circle, dubbed the Ohio Gang. Harding bet the official presidential china service. It wasn't his to lose. He lost it anyway. The man who won it allegedly took a gravy boat as proof. Harding laughed, called it a small price for good company. This wasn't out of character. It was the character. He kept a private notebook titled, "Things I Don't Understand." Inside were words he'd heard but didn't quite grasp. Inflation, horsepower, antitrust, fungible. He wasn't stupid, but he was frequently overwhelmed. He once told an aide, "I can't make my mind behave," and the mind of his administration didn't behave either. His cabinet was a mix of competence and calamity. Charles Evans Hughes and Herbert Hoover were brilliant. Albert Fall was criminal. The Teapot Dome scandal, the illegal leasing of federal oil reserves, would become one of the most notorious in American history. Harding himself wasn't directly involved, but he chose the men who were, and he didn't stop them. He never quite grasped the scale of what was happening around him. He governed like a man walking through a dinner party while the roof was on fire, clinking glasses, making toasts, hoping someone else had a bucket. He wore his socks inside out on election days. Always. He called it reversing misfortune. Staff called it the itch. He believed in signs, in gut feelings, in the strange power of repetition. He traveled with a lucky coin, a pocket knife from a childhood friend, and a yellowed envelope containing a list of campaign promises written in pencil. He never opened the envelope after the election. He said promises were meant to age before fulfillment. He had affairs, plural, one with a woman named Nan Britton, who later published a tell-all revealing that they'd conceived a child and carried on their romance in White House closets. Harding's love letters still survive. They're florid, clumsy, sometimes desperate. He called himself Warren in the third person, wrote poems, used exclamation points like they were grenades. He loved to drive, but never learned to do it well. He once crashed a government car into a gate while waving at a parade. When asked if he was injured, he replied, "Only my pride," which needed it. He gave speeches filled with abstract optimism, called America a prayer we keep repeating. Audiences cheered, not because they understood, but because they wanted to. Harding governed as if Good intentions could outweigh bad appointees. They couldn't. By 1923, the scandals were closing in. Investigations, headlines, leaks. Harding, already exhausted, took a trip west, what he called a voyage of understanding. He wanted to see the people, hear them, maybe explain, maybe escape. He never made it home. In San Francisco, he collapsed in bed. Chest pains, shortness of breath. His wife, Florence, refused an autopsy. Officially, it was a heart attack. Unofficially, speculation still simmers. Stroke, poison, stress, something worse. He died on August 2nd, 1923. The nation mourned briefly, then dug into the wreckage of his presidency. The poker nights, the backroom deals, the corrupt appointments, the missing china, and the socks. Always the socks. Harding's legacy became a cautionary tale, a presidency built on ease, undone by entropy. But behind it all, there was a man who loved being liked and never quite knew how to be feared. A man who wrote romantic nonsense in a trembling hand and signed laws with the confidence of someone praying no one would read them too closely. And after him came silence, but not for long, because the next man spoke rarely, moved minimally, and believed that the less a president did, the better the country would run. His name was Calvin Coolidge, and he made stillness into strategy. Calvin Coolidge. He didn't just dislike talking, he resented it. Calvin Coolidge believed words were currency, and most people were bankrupt from overuse. He spoke so little with such deliberate absence that people assumed he must be plotting something. He wasn't. He just didn't see the point. He once said, "No man ever listened himself out of a job," and he lived that creed so fully, so unapologetically, that his presidency became a kind of national Rorschach test. Was this silent strategy or surrender? Coolidge governed like a ghost in a tailored suit. He didn't campaign. He appeared. He didn't charm. He endured. And when he smiled, on those rare, unsettling occasions, it felt like a punctuation mark with no sentence before it. He was known as Silent Cal, a nickname he neither encouraged nor corrected. At a dinner party, a woman famously told him she'd bet she could get more than 2 words out of him. He replied, "You lose." That was the whole story. But beneath the stillness was someone stranger and sadder than the caricature suggests. He kept a pet raccoon named Rebecca, not as a novelty. As a companion, she had the run of the White House. Coolidge would hand-feed her grapes while reading economic reports. He had a custom leash made and took her on walks through the rose garden. When told it was unseemly, he simply said, "She's quieter than the cabinet." He slept with a loaded revolver in his nightstand, not for fear, for certainty. He believed silence was a form of discipline and practiced it with near monastic rigor. His schedule was sacred. Rise at 6 a.m., work in 90-minute blocks, nap for 2 hours after lunch, bed before 10. If a meeting went long, he'd simply stand up and leave. No apology, just absence. He was obsessed with economy, not just of money, but of movement. He signed fewer bills than any president since the Civil War. He vetoed ruthlessly, said government should be as unobtrusive as wallpaper. During one year, he gave only 12 press conferences, and even then, most of his answers were monosyllabic. He wore the same gray suit most days, owned a dozen identical ones to avoid the exhaustion of variance. He had his shoes resoled rather than replaced, believed excess stitching was a symptom of distraction. He once refused to attend an event because the invitation used an exclamation point. "Let the event speak for itself," he muttered. And yet, for all his quiet, the country roared. The 1920s bloomed under him. Automobiles, jazz, radios, skyscrapers. America danced while Coolidge nodded politely from the corner. He took credit for none of it, blamed himself for nothing. He reduced the national debt, cut taxes, said little. In public, he was an iceberg. In private, more iceberg. He rarely touched alcohol, believed leisure was a private affair. He owned over a dozen pairs of slippers, each labeled by weekday. He kept an envelope marked "Emotional Responses, Do Not Open." But tragedy did. In 1924, his teenage son, Calvin Jr., developed a blister while playing tennis on the White House court. The blister turned septic. He died within a week. Coolidge was never the same. He stopped playing music in the residence, stopped smiling, even privately. His journals became sparse, his speeches more halting. One aide said it was like watching a man disappear one sentence at a time. He did not seek a second full term, simply handed over the keys with a handshake and a nod. When he left office, he returned to Vermont, wrote a slim memoir, sat by the window, occasionally fed peanuts to squirrels. He died in 1933, a heart attack, fast, quiet. In his desk, they found a sheet of paper with 2 sentences written in his hand. I am content. It is enough. And then came the man who was not content. A man who believed in action, not quiet. In public service as salvation, he built dams, commissions, and conferences, but watched helplessly as the country crumbled beneath him. His name was Herbert Hoover, and he would spend the rest of his life explaining what went wrong. Herbert Hoover. He began life in an orphan's shadow and ended it in history's apology. Herbert Hoover wasn't born to fail. He was born to feed the world, and he did once. Before the presidency, before the soup lines and the shantytowns bearing his name, he was a global hero, a mining engineer turned humanitarian who saved millions from starvation in post-war Europe. In Belgium, they called him the Great Engineer. In Washington, they eventually called him the man who waited too long. Hoover entered the presidency in 1929 on a tidal wave of competence. He had managed disasters, managed systems, managed nations. He spoke the language of logistics, believed in organization the way others believed in prayer. When asked what he valued most, he once said, measurement. He kept index cards in his pockets. Always. Facts, statistics. If he couldn't categorize it, it didn't belong in his mouth. His handwriting was perfect, even under stress. He believed messy notes were a form of ethical compromise. He hated crowds, loved maps, and distrusted small talk. He once left a formal dinner after 8 minutes, telling the host, all the useful things have been said. He didn't drink, didn't dance, didn't waste time on ceremony. And when the presidency fell into his hands, confident hands, capable hands, so did the American economy. And then it fell apart. In October 1929, the stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Businesses folded, families shattered. The Great Depression began, and no one knew how to end it. Hoover tried, but he tried like an engineer, precisely, cautiously, through charts and recommendation, not fire or fury. He believed the market would correct itself, that charity, not federal aid, should fill the cracks. He feared deficits like contagion, feared direct relief would erode the American soul. People begged. He recited numbers. They starved. He issued statements. They slept in parks and under bridges. They called the shantytowns Hoovervilles. He didn't ignore them. He just couldn't pivot. He met misery with policy drafts, panic with spreadsheets. He built the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to stabilize banks and businesses. He encouraged public works, but without spending federal money directly. He thought help had to be earned, not administered. In his mind, America was a mechanism, and all mechanisms, when tuned properly, would balance themselves, but suffering doesn't wait for balance. He hated the press, called reporters professional distorters, refused to smile for photographers. He believed the presidency should be respected, not liked. When a journalist asked him to pose with a shovel at a construction site, Hoover refused, said, "I'm not here to entertain." He carried a meteorological almanac in his briefcase, believed weather patterns explained more about markets than most economists. He once paused a cabinet meeting because a barometric reading felt wrong. He collected rocks, geologically categorized, polished, labeled. He had them shipped from around the world. Each had a story. Each had been through pressure. He used a standing desk before it was fashionable. Wore gray suits so often, aides began calling them uniforms. Had a special chair built with a concealed drawer containing calming letters he'd written but never sent. It was labeled Temperance. As the Depression deepened, protests swelled. Veterans marched on Washington in 1932, demanding early payment of promised bonuses. They camped outside the city, built tents. Hoover, fearing unrest, sent in troops. Tear gas filled the streets. One child died. His image, already cracked, shattered. The election that year wasn't close. Franklin Roosevelt beat him in a landslide. Hoover packed his papers with perfect order. He left no farewell speech, only a final report. 50 pages long, detailing the state of the budget. But Hoover didn't vanish. He lived another 31 years, wrote 40 books, chaired commissions, warned, lectured, advised. He outlived Roosevelt, Truman, and much of the bitterness attached to his name. In time, history softened toward him, saw the man behind the caution, the mind behind the silence, the engineer caught in a flood without blueprints. He died in 1964, 90 years old. His final words, "I'm glad I've been useful." And then came a man who understood the power of being more than useful. He smiled like a lighthouse, walked like he belonged in a painting, and told a broken nation that fear itself was the enemy. His name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he didn't repair the machine. He rewired the country. Franklin D. Roosevelt. He couldn't walk unaided, but he carried the nation. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his name already embroidered in American myth before he ever touched the presidency, entered office like a man stepping onto a lifeboat and ordering the ocean to calm down. In 1933, the country was unraveling, banks collapsing, dust rising, lines of the hungry stretching for miles, confidence evaporating. And then there was that voice, calm, strong, unhurried. It rolled through radios like a warm blanket laid across a shivering house. He didn't bark. He didn't plead. He reassured. "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," he said. And just like that, people started listening again. But behind the voice was a body at war with itself. Roosevelt had contracted polio at 39. It paralyzed him from the waist down. He would never walk unaided again, but he refused to let the country see it. He wore heavy leg braces and leaned on aides for support. He choreographed his public movements with the precision of a stage director. Cameras were banned from showing him in a wheelchair. He once practiced standing for a speech for 5 hours straight. Falling, rising, again and again. He believed in control, not as arrogance, as survival. He ruled through ritual. He began each morning with fresh orange juice, scrambled eggs, and a cigarette holder tilted rakishly upward. He wore capes instead of coats. Not for fashion, though it helped, but for ease. Capes flowed. They didn't resist. They made him look imperial. Floating, unshakable. He collected stamps obsessively. Thousands of them. Cataloged, mounted, arranged. It soothed him. In a world spinning out, stamps stayed where they were told. He once missed a briefing on the German advance because he was reclassifying a misfiled envelope. When scolded, he said, "I needed to see something behave." He created the New Deal, a tidal wave of federal programs, agencies, and reforms. TVA, WPA, CCC, SEC, an alphabet soup of hope and bureaucracy. Critics called it socialism. He called it salvation. Bold, persistent experimentation, he said. Try something. If it fails, admit it frankly and try something else. He was the first president to speak directly to the people via radio, his fireside chats. He sat at a desk, reading calmly, as if he were talking only to you. No podium, no marble, just a voice in the room. The country tuned in, families gathered in silence. It was democracy via broadcast, intimacy scaled to millions. He loved gossip, thrived on secrets, created rivalries among his staff to keep them sharp. He'd play aides against one another, not cruelly, but strategically. He kept enemies close and friends guessing. Never let anyone know exactly what you're doing, he said. Then they'll always assume you're doing everything. He was deeply private, even in public. His smile, wide, toothy, omnipresent, was a wall. Behind it lived constant pain, physical exhaustion, and the cold awareness that every step was staged. He loved cocktails, but only if they were bad. He made them himself, usually gin, vermouth, fruit juice, and something bizarre like absinthe or fish brine. His guests hated them. He found their reactions hysterical. He once greeted a delegation of bankers in a Hawaiian shirt just to unsettle them. He believed unpredictability was its own kind of power. When an aide once asked what his long-term economic plan was, Roosevelt laughed and said, "I'm making it up as I go. But I'm very good at making things up." Then came the war. Hitler rose. Europe burned. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt addressed Congress the next day, a date which will live in infamy. His voice didn't tremble. His hands didn't shake. He led the nation into global conflict with relentless clarity. mobilized industry, forged alliances, oversaw D-Day, built the atomic groundwork without speaking its name, interned Japanese Americans in one of the darkest stains of his legacy. A decision still debated, still grieved. Roosevelt saw the country as a body to protect, and sometimes that meant cutting off limbs to save the chest. He was elected 4 times. No president before or since has served that long. By his final term, he was gaunt, hollow-cheeked. Death rode with him in every meeting. But he didn't stop. He traveled to Yalta in a wheelchair, across oceans and illness, to divide up the post-war world. He shook Stalin's hand, drew borders, made jokes, ate soup. He died in April 1945. In Warm Springs, Georgia, a stroke, mid-sentence, mid-plan. His final words, "I have a terrific headache." Eleanor, his wife, received the news while attending a meeting on civil rights. She paused, then continued. That's how the Roosevelts worked. Franklin D. Roosevelt left behind a government reshaped, a war nearly won, and a myth too large to bury. His wheelchair became a symbol not of weakness, but of endurance. His voice, replayed on wax and wire, still sounds like authority without fear. And then came a man who'd never dreamed of being president, a man who sold men's clothing, spoke in plain tones, and learned about the atomic bomb only after Roosevelt's death. His name was Harry S. Truman, and he took the weight of the world with a sigh and a fountain pen. Harry S. Truman, he didn't want the job. Not like this. Not in the middle of a world war, with half a cigarette smoked and a country waiting. When Franklin D. Roosevelt died, Harry S. Truman was summoned to the White House with no explanation. He arrived in a blur, still half adjusted to the vice presidency, and was told, "Mr. President, FDR is gone." His response, "I feel like the moon, the stars, and all the planets have fallen on me." He wasn't being poetic, just accurate. Truman wasn't polished. He wasn't born into power or primed for destiny. He was a former haberdasher who once failed in business selling men's suits. He had no college degree. He wore thick glasses and had a voice more suited to town meetings than global summits. But he had backbone, more than most. And when history cracked open in his lap, he didn't flinch. He was blunt to the point of combustion. He swore like a wounded mule and wrote letters that read like legal threats with lipstick on. He signed bills with a pen gripped too tightly and spoke in sentences that often began with, "Look here." There was nothing mysterious about Truman. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a man who made decisions, then slept on them without regret. He also played piano every morning before reading reports, said it, warmed the fingers and cleared the lies. He received the news about the Manhattan Project, America's secret atomic bomb, just weeks into the presidency. He hadn't known. Roosevelt had never told him. Now he was in charge of a weapon that could end a world war or start a new era of annihilation. He authorized the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, justified them, defended them, regretted nothing publicly. He said, "I made the only decision I could." In private, he wept, quietly, with the door closed. He loved bourbon, bow ties, and long walks. Walked every day, fast, through DC streets with no Secret Service in sight. Said it cleared his head better than advisors. He read history obsessively. Compared himself to Jackson and Jefferson, but wrote like Mark Twain with a grudge. He kept a sign on his desk, "The buck stops here." It wasn't a slogan, it was a diagnosis. Truman was a machine of daily habits. 2 eggs at breakfast, a newspaper for each hand. He bathed at precisely 6:30 a.m. and wrote letters to his wife, Bess, almost every day, even when they were in the same house. Most began with "Dear Bess" and ended with minor complaints about politics or praise for her meatloaf. He was fiercely loyal, especially to Bess. He carried a photo of her in his wallet from their wedding day until the day he died. He never removed it, not once. He desegregated the military against his party's wishes, against the South, against custom. It cost him votes. He didn't care. Said, "My grandfather owned slaves. My conscience won't." He stared down Stalin, stared down Congress, stared down his own advisors. He fired General Douglas MacArthur, one of the most beloved war heroes in America, because he challenged civilian authority. Truman said, "I don't give a damn what the general thinks." The nation gasped. Truman didn't blink. He campaigned in 1948 by train. Thousands of miles, dozens of speeches a day. No teleprompters. Just a man, a whistle stop, and a furious grin. The polls said he'd lose. The newspapers printed it early. Dewey defeats Truman. The photo of Truman holding that headline, smiling like a man who just tricked destiny, remains one of the great political punchlines in history. But he didn't run for a third term. He knew when to leave. After the White House, he returned to Missouri, refused to profit from his presidency. No corporate boards, no speaking fees, no memoirs until years later when his friends begged him. He said, "I didn't do it for the money, and I won't start now." He walked every morning until his legs gave out, visited the Truman Library, spoke to school children, wrote angry notes to journalists, argued with his dentist about fluoride. Always had an opinion. He died in 1972. No fanfare, just silence, but his fingerprints were all over the modern presidency. Atomic age diplomacy, civil rights, a powerful executive, and the enduring image of the man who said yes to the hardest question in the world. And after Truman came a war hero, a general, a strategist, a man who hated politics and played it with a reluctant grace. He painted in oils, spoke in ellipses, and warned the country about the military-industrial complex. His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower, and he led America with the quiet discipline of a man who knew how fragile victory really was. Dwight D. Eisenhower. He came from the battlefield, not the ballot box. Dwight D. Eisenhower, five-star general, architect of D-Day, liberator of Europe, entered the presidency like a man reporting for a duty he hadn't exactly requested, but would carry out to perfection anyway. He wasn't a politician in the classic sense. He didn't kiss babies, he didn't improvise, he didn't charm, he commanded, but he did it with a smile so mild it bordered on weaponized politeness. He spoke in careful, clipped phrases, filled with military brevity and Midwestern restraint. He wasn't theatrical, he wasn't thrilling. He was reassuring, a human stabilizer bar. Behind that smile, though, was a man who saw the worst the 20th century had to offer, and had no patience for chaos masquerading as charisma. He kept his desk immaculately clean. No stacks, no clutter, papers filed with military precision. He had a calendar for each task, red for military briefings, blue for public policy, green for Eisenhower time. That last one was sacred. No interruptions, no small talk. Just silence and planning. He painted to relax. Badly. Oils and brushes, landscapes and portraits, daubed with the shaky enthusiasm of a man who'd never been told no. His self-portraits were stiff. His trees leaned to the left. He once told a visitor, "It's not about beauty. It's about doing something useless well." He hated emotion in politics. Believed sentiment was a tactical liability, and yet he cried in private, deeply, especially when remembering the boys who never made it off the beaches in Normandy. His letters to Mamie, his wife, were unexpectedly tender, filled with small details, observations, worries. He called her darling, even in policy memos. He played bridge like it was war, refused to lose, kept notebooks of strategies, refused to speak for hours after a loss. Guests learned not to joke about it. He loathed disorganization. If an aide misspelled a name on a memo, that aide never worked in policy again. He once delayed a briefing because the paper stock was inconsistent. And still, he was liked. Not loved, but trusted. America felt safe with Ike. His campaign slogan, "I like Ike," wasn't marketing. It was confession. He warned of things most presidents wouldn't dare speak aloud. In his farewell address, he coined a phrase that still echoes like a moral siren: the military-industrial complex, a sprawling network of defense contractors, government spending, and perpetual war readiness. He'd helped build it, but now he feared it. He said only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry could keep it in check. Then he left the stage. But before he did, he governed with a cold, effective hand. He desegregated the military, enforced civil rights with National Guard troops, balanced budgets, built the interstate highway system, America's veins of concrete and asphalt, poured in a decade of ambition. He signed laws while chewing antacids, suffered multiple heart attacks in office, hid the extent of his illness from the public with military-grade spin. He believed the presidency should project strength. Even when the hands on the pen trembled, he distrusted nuclear weapons, thought their use was immoral in theory and catastrophe in practice. And yet he expanded America's arsenal to unprecedented levels. Deterrence, he said, was cheaper than destruction. He rarely lost his temper, but when he did, the air changed. Aides said his voice could drop into a register that silenced entire rooms. Once, when a staffer leaked a classified detail, Eisenhower looked up and said, "You've just endangered the Republic. Think about that." They did. He didn't like being touched. Shook hands like a man holding a porcelain vase. Preferred salutes. Spoke more comfortably with generals than governors. But when asked what he'd most like to be remembered for, he didn't mention the war. He said, "Peace." He retired quietly to his farm in Gettysburg. Built fences, rode horses, kept maps on the walls. He missed command, missed clarity, missed the simplicity of strategy. In his final days, he wrote a note to himself, unsigned, left in a drawer. "Did I do enough? I hope so." He died in 1969. Flags flew at half-staff. Generals saluted, presidents wept. And America in that moment looked briefly back at a man who governed without poetry but with balance, without seduction but with order. And then came the poet, a man young enough to be Eisenhower's son, with a jaw carved for cameras, a voice honed for theaters, and a vision of America that sounded like a hymn. He was Catholic, unconventional, dangerous to the old guard. His name was John F. Kennedy, and he would lead the country for only 1,000 days, but would define an era for half a century. John F. Kennedy, he spoke like the future was already here and had excellent bone structure. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, young, Catholic, charismatic, chronically ill, and always camera ready, strode into the presidency, not like a politician, but like a promise. He didn't just look different from the men before him. He sounded different. Faster, sharper, cool without coldness, serious without weight. Even his silences seemed edited for prime time. He was for many the first truly modern president, and for others, the first proof that charm could kill. His voice echoed across televisions in grainy black and white, delivering lines like commandments. "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." He didn't smile when he said it. He didn't need to. The room was already his. But behind the gleam, behind the sleek suits and military metaphors and the famous hair that never seemed to move, lived a man held together by contradiction, and sometimes by tape. He suffered from Addison's disease, a disorder of the adrenal glands. His back was a mess of ruptured discs and surgical scars. He wore a corset under his shirts, took injections just to stand straight. At times, the pain was so bad, he couldn't tie his shoes. But he made it look effortless. That was his superpower. Pain that never leaked. He swam every morning, not for leisure, but to keep from seizing up. He took pills, so many pills, for pain, for energy, for digestion. He once joked his medical chart looked like a pharmacy's trash bin, but he kept moving. Always moving. He read speedily, spoke quickly, and hated wasted time. He devoured briefings like novels, dictated notes from his bed, memorized diplomatic names as if cramming for an exam he intended to ace with charm alone. He kept a coconut shell on his desk. On it was carved a message he had once scratched into the husk while stranded in the Pacific during World War II, after his boat had been destroyed. That coconut had saved his life. Now it held down papers in the Oval Office like a paperweight made of memory and luck. He believed in theater, understood imagery, knew that optics were policy's twin. He debated Nixon on national television and didn't win with words. He won by looking better, cooler, healthier, more composed. The camera loved him. The microphone feared him. He believed in space, not metaphorically, literally. He pledged to send a man to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was televised. "We choose to go," he said, and the country followed. He was painting a future in orbital arcs, wrapping science in poetry. But he also believed in secrets. He trusted very few. He leaned on his brother Bobby like a second spinal cord, surrounded himself with youth, loyalty, intelligence, and at times, beautiful distractions. The list of women he entertained in the shadows is as long as the list of policies he debated in daylight. He compartmentalized compulsively. One drawer for diplomacy, one for jokes, one for medication, and all of it ran on speed, literal and metaphorical. He was not patient. In 1961, he greenlit the Bay of Pigs, a botched invasion of Cuba, humiliating, ill-planned, a disaster he inherited, authorized, and owned. He faced the press 2 days later, took the blame, didn't blink. Victory has 100 fathers, he said, but defeat is an orphan. Then came the Cuban Missile Crisis. October 1962. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, the world's breath held between two fingers on a button. Kennedy stared down Khrushchev with a poker face and a grim, backroom ballet of diplomacy. Blockades. Letters. Ultimatums. No blinking. No speeches until the end. The crisis passed. The missiles left, barely. He was 45. He also loved practical jokes. Wrote funny notes to his children. Doodled during briefings. Scribbled caricatures of senators in the margins of memos. One aide said he never lost his sense of being slightly amused by everything he was supposed to take seriously. He was deeply religious and utterly irreverent. Once asked if he was the first Catholic president, he said, "I don't know, but I'm probably the first one who's been to confession recently." He died on November 22nd, 1963, Dallas. A motorcade, a rifle, a nation's innocence gone in 6.3 seconds. The shot tore through the dream, the hope, the lie that charisma could shield you. He was 46. His final hours were spent next to Jackie, stoic, blood-soaked, silent. She wouldn't change clothes, said she wanted the world to see what they'd done to Jack. The image of her beside him, pink suit, splattered, unbroken, is one of the 20th century's cruelest postcards. He was buried at Arlington. An eternal flame lit at his grave, and then the world turned to the man standing behind him on that motorcade. Lyndon Baines Johnson, a giant of a man, loud, earthy, crude, brilliant, and unafraid to shove history out of his way. Kennedy floated. Johnson bulldozed. Lyndon B. Johnson. He didn't whisper. He loomed. Lyndon Baines Johnson didn't walk into a room. He entered like a thunderclap with paperwork. At 6 feet 4 inches and powered by a political voltage most men couldn't survive, LBJ didn't just hold office, he wrangled it. He talked fast, barged close, and governed like the Oval Office was his personal ranch, and history was a stubborn bull that needed breaking. He was the opposite of Kennedy in almost every way. Raw where JFK was polished, coarse where Jack was graceful, towering where he had floated. But LBJ didn't care. He respected vision. He preferred results. He called it the treatment. It was his way of getting what he wanted. Lean in close, stare unblinking, speak faster than you could breathe, flatter, threaten, charm, corner. He'd poke your chest with one hand while draping his other arm over your shoulder like you were old war buddies plotting a coup. Senators cracked under the pressure like tin roofs in a Texas storm. He could smell weakness, and he didn't blink at exploiting it. He was born in a farmhouse in Texas, poor as dirt and hungry for everything. His rise was fast, furious, and full of backroom grit. He made calls at midnight, promised favors like poker chips. He'd pass a bill in the morning and have it framed by dinner. And when Kennedy was assassinated, LBJ was sworn in on Air Force One beside Jackie, her pink suit still stained. He didn't flinch. He placed his hand on a Catholic missile. He didn't ask if the country was ready. He made it ready. He hit the ground, legislating like a man in a bar fight with history. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Voting Rights Act of 1965. Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, fair housing, the war on poverty. He called it the Great Society. Others called it government bloat. He called it doing what Kennedy dreamed, but never lived long enough to force through Congress. But behind the legacy was a haunted man. He feared being forgotten. Obscured, buried beneath Kennedy's ghost. He kept photos of JFK in his office, not out of reverence, but rivalry. Let them see who got it done, he once muttered. He worked like a man on fire. Rarely slept. Shouted at aides while sitting on the toilet, doors wide open. He believed shame was inefficient. He had a phone installed in the bathroom for urgent calls. Urgency for Johnson was constant. He had gallbladder surgery and insisted the nation see his scar on TV. Said it was proof the president's guts were still good. He loved dogs, barbecue, and politics. Not necessarily in that order. He wore pants tailored with extra room in the crotch. Literally called the White House dry cleaner to explain why. There's an audio recording of it. It's uncomfortable. It's Lyndon. He had a secret button in the Oval Office that summoned his favorite beverage, Fresca. He drank it obsessively. When staff suggested it was unbecoming, he said, "I'll run the damn country and drink soda. You can handle one." He was equal parts bleeding heart and brass knuckles. But then came Vietnam. What began as cautious involvement exploded into a war without exit. He escalated, bombed, drafted, watched the protests rise, the body bags mount, the trust dissolve. He agonized, wandered the halls at night, listened to tapes of speeches, trying to hear where it went wrong. He hated being hated. Hated more being helpless. The war swallowed everything. His victories, his ambitions, his credibility. He shocked the world in 1968 when he announced, flat-voiced, "I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The war had outlasted his will. He left office broken, tired, and bitter, retired to his Texas ranch, grew his hair long, gave interviews through clenched teeth, watched Nixon take office, watched the country fracture further, watched his legacy hang by a thread of legislation. He died in 1973, a heart attack, age 64. He spent his final years rereading the laws he'd passed, scribbling notes in the margins like a student terrified of failing his own test. Today, his name sits on a knife edge, half savior, half cautionary tale. And the man who followed him rode in on promises of healing, but carried a folder labeled Enemies List. He hated the press, trusted no one, sweated through every lie like it owed him loyalty. His name was Richard Milhous Nixon, and he would break open the presidency, then drown in the flood he'd unleashed. Richard Nixon. He arrived with a grimace and left with a wave. Richard Milhous Nixon, brilliant, paranoid, relentless, and undone, was the only president in American history to resign in disgrace. But that was the end of the story. The beginning was something stranger. He was awkward on camera, always had been. Too sweaty, too stiff, too suspicious of his own smile. He didn't win people over. He wore them down. He didn't inspire. He outlasted. And when he finally reached the White House in 1969, after years of clawing back from political exile, he looked less like a man who'd won the job than one who had finally cornered it. He kept lists of enemies, of allies, of people he wasn't sure about yet. He marked them with stars, dashes, annotations, kept notes on handshakes, grip strength, palm moisture. He once instructed an aide never to trust anyone who smiles more than once every minute. He trusted no one, especially not success. Nixon rose from poverty. Dirt floor childhood, no spotlight, no inheritance. He built himself out of rejection, every snub, every slight, every whispered insult behind a closed door. He remembered. He wrote it down, filed it away. One aide called his memory a filing cabinet full of grudges, and yet he was brilliant, a foreign policy genius, a cold warrior who went to China, the first American president to shake hands with Mao Zedong, a man who stared down the Soviet Union and signed arms control treaties with a phone in one hand and suspicion in the other. He negotiated from shadows, believed diplomacy worked better when no one knew what was agreed to. Madman theory, he called it. Make the world think you're unstable enough to do anything, and they'll do what you want to avoid finding out. At home, he created the EPA, launched OSHA, enforced desegregation of schools more effectively than his predecessors, proposed universal health insurance, even flirted with universal basic income. None of it made him beloved. He paced the White House alone at night, talking to portraits, muttering, drinking, listening to old recordings of his own speeches and analyzing their pauses. He distrusted tears, except his own. He cried often, behind closed doors, with a handkerchief over his mouth. He loved football. Not the game, the power dynamics. He had diagrams made of team formations to study control and pressure. Once tried to send a play suggestion to the Redskins coach. It was ignored. He had a dog named Checkers, memorialized in a speech that saved his early political career. He milked that dog for empathy like a seasoned manipulator, said, "The kids love the dog and we're gonna keep it." And they did. And he stayed. His personal habits were clockwork strange. He ate cottage cheese with ketchup daily. He wore suits while relaxing. He hated makeup, refused stage lights, then blamed lighting when debates made him look sweaty and sickly. He recorded everything, every conversation, every whisper. He had microphones hidden in the Oval Office, in his phones, in the residence. Not for posterity, for protection. In case anyone lied, he could prove them wrong. But the tapes became his undoing. Watergate began as a petty break-in, 5 men caught in the DNC headquarters. But the trail led back to money, to meetings, to cover-ups, to orders. Nixon denied involvement, then denied knowledge, then denied knowledge of the denial. The walls closed in. The press dug deeper. The courts sharpened. Congress stirred. Nixon fought like a cornered animal, clawing, bluffing, begging, stonewalling. He said, "I am not a crook." He was. The tapes proved it. The smoking gun crackled on analog reels. Obstruction of justice, abuse of power, the evidence was his own voice. And so, in August 1974, he resigned. He did not weep. He did not apologize. He shook hands, smiled grimly, waved from the steps of Marine One with both arms raised in a crooked V. Victory, defiance, delusion. He left behind a country shattered, and a vice president who now had to mop up the blood without moving the body. Gerald Ford, a man who never ran for president, never wanted the job, and gave America a pardon it couldn't forgive. Gerald Ford. He was the answer to a constitutional math problem. Insert vice president, subtract a scandal, divide the nation. Gerald Ford didn't run for president. He didn't campaign. He didn't scheme. He was simply next. After Nixon's resignation, the country didn't turn to him with hope. It handed him the keys like a tired relative asking someone else to drive for a while. Ford took them without ceremony. His first words as president, "Our long national nightmare is over," but the country was still in bed, sweating through the sheets, and Ford, honest, affable, clumsy Gerald Ford, was the man sent to change them. He'd been a football star at Michigan, a war hero, a congressman for 25 years. Reliable, dull in a reassuring way. His handshake felt like something a neighbor offered over a freshly painted fence. He wasn't brilliant, he wasn't poetic, but he was real. And that, oddly, was the risk. He didn't wear armor. He wore golf shirts. He fell. Often. On camera, downstairs, off platforms. Once tripped exiting Air Force One and turned into a national punchline. Chevy Chase turned his presidency into slapstick. Ford never complained, just chuckled and watched the ratings. He was deeply superstitious, kept a lucky penny in his shoe during key votes, slept with a rabbit's foot in his sock drawer, refused to sign anything with red ink. It reminded him of blood. His briefings were color-coded to match his ties. He called it visual discipline. He read Reader's Digest in the bathroom, cover to cover, and he played golf obsessively, often mid-crisis. He said the backswing cleared his head better than intelligence reports. His Secret Service detail dreaded the trips. He hit erratically. Once struck a spectator in the mouth, another time a bird. And then, just 31 days into his presidency, he pardoned Nixon. He didn't hesitate. He said it was for the country. Our national obsession with past wrongs cannot be allowed to go on. The country erupted. Approval ratings collapsed. Conspiracy theories bloomed. Was there a deal? A cover-up? Ford, for his part, simply stood there and took the political lightning bolt like a man too tired to duck. Later, when he received the John F. Kennedy Profile and Courage Award, he said, "I had to do what was right, not what was popular." He meant it. He pushed for economic reform, fought inflation with buttons, literal ones. "Whip inflation now," they read. Win. Americans wore them sarcastically. Inflation didn't care. He battled Congress over defense spending, tax cuts, the Cold War, and whether the president could lead without charisma. His speeches were straightforward, his arguments precise. His delivery? wooden, but sincere. He trusted institutions, trusted process, trusted the Constitution. He did not trust astrologers, ghostwriters, or showmanship. He didn't believe in spectacle, which in post-Watergate America was a spectacle in itself. And yet, he survived an assassination attempt twice, both in California, both by women. One was Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a Manson cult follower. The other, Sarah Jane Moore, fired a shot that missed by inches. Ford flinched, ducked, and kept walking. Later, he said only, "You can't let a bullet change your stride." He ran in 1976 and lost to Jimmy Carter by a hair. He left office the way he entered it, without bitterness. He wrote letters, built a library, pardoned a turkey for Thanksgiving and actually named it after his golf instructor. He lived a long life, outliving nearly all of his contemporaries. When asked what he wanted his legacy to be, he said, "That I made the Constitution work." And then he died, aged 93, a quiet end for a man who never raised his voice, never schemed, never claimed to be great. He simply showed up when no one else could, and stayed on his feet, even when he fell. After him came the peanut farmer, the Sunday school teacher, a man who saw America not as a machine to manage, but a soul to redeem. His name was Jimmy Carter, and he would try to save the country with a Bible, a toolbox, and an unshakable belief that doing the right thing was more important than doing the popular one. Jimmy Carter, he came from the fields, not the factories. Jimmy Carter, naval officer, peanut farmer, nuclear engineer, born-again Baptist, walked into the White House like a man who thought government could still be good, that honesty was enough, and that integrity, if spoken softly enough, would echo louder than slogans. America didn't quite know what to make of him. He quoted scripture in press conferences, wore sweaters on television, rode in limousines but carried his own bags, refused to tell lies even when they would have helped. He told Playboy magazine he'd lusted in his heart, and the nation, already cynical and freshly scorched from Watergate and Vietnam, blinked. They wanted decency. He gave them full confession. He was, in every possible way, a moral president, and that somehow became his curse. He didn't use the Oval Office on his first day, said he wasn't ready, worked from a smaller desk, took off his jacket, and banned "Hail to the Chief" at events. "I work for you," he said. "I don't need an anthem." He read more than he spoke, annotated reports in red pen, wrote margins like sermons. He kept a daily journal, not for posterity, but for reflection. "It's easier to tell the truth when you've recorded what happened," he said. He loved tools, personally repaired windows in the White House, installed a solar water heater on the roof, held cabinet meetings in jeans. Staff called it the denim directive. He said people worked better when their pants didn't cost more than their car. He fasted on Thursdays in solidarity with the world's hungry, canceled extravagant state dinners, substituted local wines, and served soup with cornbread. When guests grumbled, he said, "We're not here to impress anyone." But then came inflation, energy crises, gas lines that curled around blocks, the Iranian Revolution, the hostage crisis, and a national mood so brittle you could hear it cracking every time he gave a speech. So he gave a new kind of speech, not about policy, but about the soul. It became known as the crisis of confidence speech. He spoke of consumption, of national malaise, of a moral reckoning that couldn't be fixed with tax cuts. In a nation that was once proud of hard work, strong families, close-knit communities, too many of us now tend to worship self-indulgence and consumption. Critics called it defeatist. Americans felt scolded. Carter felt honest. His schedule was austere, up before 5, devotions, coffee, jogging. He read intelligence briefings like hymns, slow, serious, without skipping the painful verses. He carried a laminated copy of the Beatitudes in his wallet, believed deeply in forgiveness but not in forgetting. He micromanaged, down to room thermostats. Once personally selected the seating chart for a working lunch between diplomats from Cyprus and Greece, based on who'd insulted whom last. But he also orchestrated the Camp David Accords. 13 days of tension between Egypt and Israel. Carter personally negotiated, read body language, wrote the names of the leaders' children on index cards, and used them to humanize the talks. He brokered peace that would outlast him, then walked back to his cabin, alone. The Iran hostage crisis broke him. 52 Americans trapped in Tehran for 444 days. Every day he counted them, prayed over their names, refused to bomb the city, refused to trade arms, launched a rescue mission. It failed. Helicopters crashed in the desert. Soldiers died. The images played on every television in America. He aged a decade in a year. When Reagan beat him in 1980, Carter shook his hand, smiled tightly, and flew home to Plains, Georgia. There he began the longest, most improbable second act in presidential history. He built homes for the poor, wrote poetry, taught Sunday school, won the Nobel Peace Prize, monitored elections in 40 countries, survived brain cancer, said every night with Rosalind, his wife, was a prayer with arms. He lived past 98, but while he lived long, he governed briefly. And during that brief, blistering time, he tried to lead a country not with power, but with conscience. And then came a man who believed image wasn't a liability. It was the whole job. He told stories, flashed a grin, and made the country feel good again, even when the truth was harder than the punchline. His name was Ronald Reagan, and he didn't just change politics, he changed the script. Ronald Reagan, he came with a script and a spotlight. Ronald Reagan, the Hollywood cowboy turned governor, turned commander-in-chief, didn't just occupy the presidency, he performed it. With a twinkle in his eye, a tilt of the head, and a voice that could make deficit spending sound like bedtime, Reagan turned the most powerful office in the world into the world's most watched stage. He called America a shining city on a hill, and for a country tired of grim speeches, high gas prices, and hostage headlines, the lights came up on Act 1. He was a former Democrat who became the conservative saint, a union leader who broke strikes, a fiscal hawk who ran record deficits, a government skeptic who expanded the state. He contained multitudes and reduced them to catchphrases. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. There you go again. Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. He delivered those lines like a man who knew the close-up was coming. But behind the charm was calculation. He read daily briefings written like movie scripts. Bullet points, clear protagonists, no ambiguity. He disliked nuance. It slowed down the plot. He preferred emotional clarity to factual complexity. And it worked. Reagan didn't drown in details. He surfed them. Trusted staff to steer. He was the captain waving from the deck, not the one adjusting the rudder, and people loved him for it. He wore suits like armor, favored brown, believed blue ties softened the blow, carried jelly beans everywhere, a habit he picked up to quit smoking and never abandoned. Oval Office meetings included crystal bowls of the stuff. He claimed the flavor of a jelly bean could determine someone's character. He gave Mikhail Gorbachev licorice. Gorbachev hated licorice. Reagan thought that was funny. He had a private, peculiar habit. He wrote diary entries in capital letters. Every day, long reflections, policy notes, idle musings, all in an all-caps scrawl that looked more like a shouting telegram than introspection. He believed in astrology. After John Hinckley Jr. tried to assassinate him in 1981, shooting him in the chest outside a D.C. hotel, his wife, Nancy, turned to the stars. She hired an astrologer who quietly advised the White House schedule. Reagan never confirmed how much he believed in it, but meetings were moved, flights delayed, alignments checked, policy paused for Pluto. He recovered from the assassination attempt faster than anyone expected, walked into the hospital, joked to doctors, "I hope you're all Republicans." It was pure Reagan, affable, disarming, myth-ready. He hated being seen as angry, never raised his voice, delivered rebukes like lullabies. Once told a hostile reporter, "I'm not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience." The room laughed. His opponent never recovered, but the charm masked shadows. His administration was racked by scandals, the most notorious, Iran-Contra, secret arms deals, hostage trades, funds funneled to Nicaraguan rebels. Reagan claimed he didn't know, or didn't remember, or both. Congress investigated, reporters pressed, and Reagan, ever the actor, looked confused, then sorry, then vaguely wounded. It worked. His approval dipped, then rebounded. People forgave because they liked him, liked the way he made them feel. In politics, emotion outlives evidence. He pushed deregulation, slashed taxes, escalated military spending, called the Soviet Union the evil empire, then sat down with Gorbachev and signed arms reduction treaties. He flipped the script and got a standing ovation. He changed the tone of politics, not with policy, but with posture. He loved horseback riding, cutting brush on his ranch, chopping wood for the cameras. Said it made him feel presidential. Refused to speak poorly of his opponents. Said it lowered the character of the stage. By his second term, the symptoms of cognitive decline began to appear. He lost his place in speeches, misremembered facts, but his team adjusted. Shorter briefings, larger text, more applause lines. When he left office, he had the highest approval ratings since FDR. He wrote a letter to the public in 1994 announcing his Alzheimer's diagnosis. It ended, "I now begin the journey that will lead me into the sunset of my life." He died 10 years later. His funeral was a national production. Presidents past and present, flags at half-mast, eulogies wrapped in nostalgia. Reagan had entered history's bloodstream not as a policy giant, but as a feeling. George H.W. Bush. He didn't crave the spotlight. He respected it. George Herbert Walker Bush, World War II. Hero, CIA director, ambassador, vice president, president. Came from a world where duty mattered more than applause, and restraint was not weakness, but form. He was polite to the point of discomfort. Called everyone sir or ma'am, even adversaries. He wrote more thank you notes than any president in modern history, signed them personally, neatly, sometimes with doodles in the margin. People joked that if you sneezed near Bush, you'd get a handwritten card in 2 days. Hope the sniffles passed. Best, George. But he was tougher than he looked. At 20, he was shot down over the Pacific. His plane on fire, his crew dead, the sky falling. He bailed out, floated alone in a life raft, eyes fixed on the sky, stomach turning from oil fumes and salt. Sharks circled. He threw up, waited, and then, rising out of the water like something out of Pulp Fiction, a U.S. submarine. He was rescued by sailors who couldn't believe the future president of the United States had just flopped onto their deck like a sea-wet miracle. He carried that moment with him forever. The memory, the loss of his crew, the sense of borrowed time. He never bragged about it, but he mentioned it when things got dark, like it was a compass. He climbed every rung of the political ladder. Congressman, United Nations ambassador, envoy to China, CIA director, vice president. Each title etched into his resume like climbing holds on a cliff. His voice never changed. Always soft, patrician, almost apologetic. But behind the preppy drawl was someone who understood power intimately and rarely misused it. He was pragmatic, ran on no new taxes, then raised taxes. Because he believed the country needed it, it cost him re-election. He never apologized. He was awkward in public, eloquent in private, hated broccoli, loved speedboats, said read my lips once and regretted it forever, had a dog named Millie who wrote a best-selling book, claimed Millie was smarter than some members of Congress. No one argued. And then there was Japan. January 8th, 1992, a state dinner. Fancy china, formal wear, lights low, cameras rolling. Bush, in the middle of a toast, turned pale, then green, then down. He vomited onto the lap of Japanese Prime Minister Kiichi Miyazawa. Slumped forward, the room froze. Aides rushed in. The moment was broadcast live. Over and over, the first sitting president to throw up on foreign soil, literally. In Japan, a phrase was coined, bushusuru, translation, to do a bush. He recovered, laughed about it, moved on, because George H.W. Bush had done far worse than embarrass himself. He had been humiliated by history. The Cold War ended on his watch. Peace broke out. Walls fell, flags changed, and Bush didn't take a victory lap. No speeches at the Brandenburg Gate, no mission accomplished, just a nod, a breath, a belief that statesmen didn't need applause to matter. Then came Iraq. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Bush built a coalition. Dozens of nations, billions of dollars, careful diplomacy. He launched Operation Desert Storm. It was quick, decisive, efficient. Military brilliance by way of military restraint. He stopped short of Baghdad. Critics called it weak, others called it wisdom. He believed America's job wasn't to occupy, but to stabilize. He skydived for his 75th birthday, then did it again at 80 and 85 and 90, each time strapped to an instructor, wind flattening his tie, lips flapping like paper, hands splayed in that bizarre presidential freefall. He said it made him feel alive and grateful. When he lost re-election to Bill Clinton, he didn't pout. He left a handwritten note on the Resolute desk that read, "Your success now is our country's success. I am rooting hard for you." It remains one of the most graceful exits in political history. He lived to see his son become president, then lived to see his son become complicated. He didn't always agree with W, but he stood by him, quietly, firmly. He died in 2018, at home, in bed. His final words, "I love you too," to his son. And the last letter he wrote was to the Secret Service agents who had guarded him for decades, thanking them. George H.W. Bush didn't yell. He didn't burn, he didn't dazzle, but he endured. And after him came the comeback kid, slick, southern, genius and rogue in equal measure. He played saxophone, knew policy like scripture, and balanced scandal on a smile. His name was Bill Clinton, and he governed like a man trying to redeem and outrun himself. Bill Clinton. He walked in with rhythm. Bill Clinton, part policy prodigy, part Elvis impersonator, full-time political survivor, didn't just become president. He hustled into the job. He could talk anyone into anything. Senators, CEOs, the guy behind the counter at a McDonald's. He didn't read rooms. He devoured them. And if George H.W. Bush was the polite whisper of old-world diplomacy, Clinton was the full-volume mixtape of a new America. Chaotic, charismatic, scandal-prone, and always on. He could charm with a glance, filibuster with a handshake, and turn a town hall into a revival tent. His saxophone solo on late-night TV sealed more political momentum than 3 debates combined. He could make budget projections sound like love letters and personal apologies sound like closing arguments. And it wasn't all show. Behind the boyish grin and southern drawl was a mind like a file cabinet caught in a tornado. Chaotic, dense, brilliant. He read policy briefs in bulk, corrected footnotes, gave advisors pop quizzes. He'd dive into a 900-page economic report and then pivot, without blinking, to a 3-hour speech about urban redevelopment delivered to a half-empty union hall. And then there were the contradictions. He ate fast food daily, loved Big Macs, could name the ingredients blindfolded, once made the Secret Service stop a motorcade because he smelled fries, jogged in sweatpants that should have been declared unconstitutional, sweated through town halls, hugged everyone, remembered names, forgot boundaries. He was brilliant and undisciplined. His policies, centrist acrobatics. He reformed welfare, passed the crime bill, deregulated banks, balanced the budget, cut deficits, and presided over the longest peacetime economic expansion in U.S. history. He embraced globalization, backed NAFTA, angered labor, seduced Wall Street, then turned around and declared himself the champion of the working class. He was the Democratic answer to Reagan, equal parts empathy and optics, economic ambition wrapped in personal ambiguity, but the personal never stayed personal. First there was Jennifer Flowers, then Paula Jones, then Monica Lewinsky. The names came like raindrops, drip, drip, deluge. The Lewinsky scandal wasn't just a breach of trust. It was a breach of dignity, broadcast live. He denied it, repeatedly, then admitted it, casually, then retracted nothing. He parsed verbs, held press conferences where apology and evasion danced cheek to cheek. He was impeached, only the second president in U.S. history. The charges, perjury, and obstruction of justice. The Senate acquitted him. He left office with some of the highest approval ratings ever recorded. Even his enemies admitted he'd weathered storms that would have crushed most men. He was nicknamed the comeback kid for a reason, but he never really left. After the White House, he became the most active ex-president in American history. He founded a global foundation, raised billions for health and disaster relief, gave more speeches than all previous presidents combined, and charged more per word than Shakespeare ever dreamed of. He never stopped talking, never stopped working, never stopped trying to explain himself. He once said, "I may not have been the greatest president, but I've been the greatest former president." And behind the scenes, he wrestled daily with the legacy he couldn't quite control, the policy wins, and the character questions, the boom years, and the women, the charisma that changed rooms, and the rumors that never left him. And then he watched his wife run for the job he once held and lose. Twice. Bill Clinton's story is one of contrasts: policy brilliance, personal chaos, global acclaim, and private regrets stitched together with a needle made of charm. He played every room like it was his living room. And when he finally sat down, the next man stood up like a question mark in a flight suit, quiet, disciplined, decisive, the son of a president, the president during war. His name was George W. Bush, and he would lead America into the 21st century, only to have it collapse in flames before his eyes. George W. Bush. He called himself the Decider. George Walker Bush, Texan drawl, born-again clarity, a Yale degree hiding beneath cowboy boots, entered the White House as the second act to a dynasty and the first president of a new century. He came in lighthearted, half grinning through awkward speeches, and left with 2 wars, a collapsed economy, and a face visibly aged by the weight of disaster. He wasn't supposed to get this far. Not even he expected it. In the beginning, people laughed. He mispronounced words, strategery, nuclear, mixed metaphors strayed from scripts, invented aphorisms on the fly like a man trying to outpace his own mouth. But behind the mangled sentences was a spine hardened by conviction, loyalty, and, after September 11th, grief. He won the presidency in 2000 by not quite winning, lost the popular vote, won the Electoral College. Florida hung in the balance, literally on hanging chads. The Supreme Court called it. America didn't breathe normally for weeks. Then one morning, it was simply decided. Bush took office with a shrug, a prayer, and a joke. He told the press, "Some people call you the elite. I call you my base." They laughed. Sort of. He ran as a compassionate conservative, promised humility, modesty, tax cuts with a smile. He spoke of unity, of education, of fixing the soft bigotry of low expectations. Then came the September event, and everything changed. The Twin Towers fell, the Pentagon burned, smoke filled the sky, and the ground shifted beneath every assumption about peace, safety, and time. Bush stood atop rubble with a bullhorn and told the country, "I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear all of us soon." The words weren't elegant, they were steel. He declared a war on terror, launched strikes in Afghanistan, toppled the Taliban, then, with less certainty and more ambition, turned to Iraq. Weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein. Axis of evil. The case was made. The war began, and there were no weapons. The war continued. American soldiers died. Civilians died. Chaos reigned. Bush insisted history would vindicate him, that democracy was a seed and Iraq would bloom. Meanwhile, at home, he created the Department of Homeland Security, passed the Patriot Act, approved enhanced interrogations, oversaw mass surveillance, said he was protecting freedom. Critics said he was rewriting the Constitution with black ink and blurred lines. He didn't flinch. His approval ratings once soared to over 90%, then cratered, then climbed, then dropped again. He governed inside a storm and acted like it was just wind. He painted later in life, quietly, portraits of veterans, dogs, himself. The brushstrokes were uncertain, oddly tender. He never apologized for Iraq, but the eyes in his paintings always seemed to. He believed in loyalty, ferociously, to staff, to friends, to those who stood by him. He once told a cabinet member, "I value people who don't flinch." That became his inner circle, steel-eyed, flinch-proof, echoing back what he needed to hear. He loved baseball, called games in college, threw the first pitch at Yankee Stadium after September 2001 in a bulletproof vest, strike, right down the middle. He grinned. America exhaled. He hated broccoli, still does. He slept well, even during crisis. said worry was for God to handle. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. The levees broke, the city drowned, and the federal response was slow, detached. Bush praised his FEMA director on camera. "Brownie, you're doing a heck of a job." The country didn't agree. That phrase became a punchline, then a wound. By the end of his presidency, the economy was collapsing. Banks failed, markets crashed, foreclosures exploded. He signed the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, to stabilize the financial system. Conservatives called it betrayal. Liberals called it too late, and then he left, gracefully. No complaints, no relitigation, no undermining his successor. He went home to Texas, built a library, painted in silence. In his final days in office, he told his staff, "History will get the last word." And then the last word passed to a man who campaigned on hope, surfed a wave of history, and made the improbable look inevitable. He carried rhythm in his voice and change in his skin. His name was Barack Obama, and he would inherit the wreckage and try to build something new on the rubble. Barack Obama. He began as a whisper, then became a wave. Barack Hussein Obama, son of a Kenyan exchange student and a Kansas-born dreamer, was a long shot with a long name and an impossible pitch. That America, fractured and fearful, could still be moved by hope. He gave a speech in 2004, just a senator, barely known, and the nation stopped. Not for the policies, for the voice, the cadence, the rhythm that borrowed from pulpit and lecture hall, that wrapped conviction in calm and left behind the scent of something we'd almost forgotten. Belief. 4 years later, he was president. He was the first black man to hold the office, but he didn't lead with that. He led with audacity, the audacity of hope, of change, of dignity in disagreement. He believed politics could be moral again, not perfect, but better. And people followed. They chanted his name like a drum beat. Obama, Obama. Held up signs with one word. Hope. It felt like a movement wrapped in a man. And when he raised his hand on January 20th, 2009, and took the oath, it wasn't just a transfer of power. It was a recalibration of possibility, but governing is not poetry. He inherited collapse. 2 wars, a cratered economy, housing market in freefall, unemployment spiking, confidence in ashes. He stepped into the White House and opened a briefing that read more like an obituary than a strategy memo. And then he went to work. The Recovery Act, bank bailouts, auto industry rescue. Critics screamed socialism. Obama smiled politely, signed the papers, said, "We do big things." He passed the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, fought for it, bled for it politically, got 0 Republican votes. Town halls turned into shouting matches. Protesters waved death panels and fake birth certificates. But he won. 30 million more Americans got health coverage. Insurance companies couldn't deny you for pre-existing conditions anymore. The law barely passed, nearly broke his presidency. He wore a tan suit once. People lost their minds. He played basketball. Left-handed jump shot, smooth, ran the court with staff, trash-talked policy advisors mid-layup, once drained 3 straight threes during a visit to troops, and told reporters, "That's what I do." He liked almonds, 8 of them, every night, no more, no less. Measured, ritualistic. He had a kill list, targeted drone strikes, weekly briefings with names, faces, probabilities, terrorist leaders overseas, some American citizens. He made the calls, quietly, carried the weight, said it was war, even if no one declared it. He never lost his temper publicly, but behind closed doors, he was known to lace his speeches with sarcasm so sharp, it cut through bulletproof egos. He called D.C. the city that waits for you to fail. He had daughters, loved them fiercely, danced on stage with them, ducked out of meetings to attend their recitals, read briefing memos with one eye on Sasha's homework. He ordered the raid that killed Osama bin Laden. Navy SEALs, night vision, helicopters in, helicopters out. One crashed. No Americans died. Bin Laden shot in the head. Buried at sea, Obama watched it unfold in real time. Then he walked to the East Room, delivered the news like a man breaking a spell. He won a Nobel Peace Prize in his first year. Even he admitted, "I don't deserve it." But he tried to, with diplomacy, with climate accords, with quiet resilience in the face of storms, literal and cultural. He faced 8 years of obstruction. Mitch McConnell said his mission was to make Obama a one-term president. He failed. Birthers questioned his birthplace. Racists sent him threats. Every cough became a conspiracy. Every pause, an opening, Obama just smiled, then passed legislation. He used humor like a scalpel. At the White House Correspondents' Dinner, he mocked Donald Trump to his face, said, "No one is prouder to put this birth certificate matter to rest than the Donald." Trump didn't laugh. Obama dropped the mic, literally, and still, he couldn't stop the rise of Trumpism, the backlash, the disillusionment. For all the poetry, America still fractured. The cracks deepened, the anger returned. He handed over the keys in 2017 to the man who had questioned his very citizenship, and he didn't flinch. He left a note, a warm, measured letter on Oval Office stationery, encouraging, graceful, presidential. Then he left the White House with his wife beside him, head high, tie straight, walking into the January cold like a man who knew he'd just become history and hoped he hadn't become a warning. And after him came the noise, the spectacle, the president who didn't read the briefing but became the headline. His name was Donald J. Trump, and everything was about to get louder. Donald J. Trump. He didn't enter the presidency. He commandeered it. Donald John Trump, real estate tycoon, reality TV host, tabloid fixture, and political anomaly, took the oath of office with one hand raised and the other still holding a grudge against the press, against the polls, against the very idea that he couldn't win. He was not a politician. He didn't pretend to be. He was a brand, an empire, a set of gold-plated instincts wrapped in a red tie that hung too long. And from the moment he descended that golden escalator in 2015 and declared, "They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists," the American political stage tilted. Some heard alarm bells, others heard a war drum, but everyone heard it. He won the presidency in 2016 against every prediction, every poll, every assumption about decorum, democracy, and the durability of reality. Hillary Clinton had the experience. Trump had the algorithm, anger, grievance, fear, spectacle. He turned rallies into roving confessionals, late-night tweets into policy, scandal into currency. He was elected, he claimed, to drain the swamp, then filled his cabinet with billionaires, family members, and figures who cycled through headlines faster than they could order office furniture. He kept a button on his desk that summoned Diet Coke. He watched hours of cable news, reacted in real time, measured staff loyalty not by credentials, but by screen presence. He once held a televised cabinet meeting where each member took turns praising him like nervous contestants on a game show. The Secretary of Energy called it the honor of my life. Trump nodded. He lived inside the spotlight. It fed him. It followed him. It bent to him. He didn't read intelligence briefings unless they had pictures, preferred bullet points, charts, names in bold. He distrusted experts, trusted his gut, believed more in being smart than in knowing things. He tweeted more than any president in history. At 2 a.m., 5 a.m., mid-meeting, typos became doctrine. Covfefe trended for days. Critics mocked. Followers merchandised. And yet, under the noise, came real consequences. He passed sweeping tax cuts, appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, shifting the balance for a generation, rolled back environmental regulations, withdrew from the Paris Climate Accord, tore up the Iran nuclear deal, moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem. He governed like a demolition crew, sometimes intentionally. He met Kim Jong-un, smiled for photos, called him Rocket Man, then a friend. The diplomacy was unconventional, erratic, mostly symbolic. But no nukes flew. Then came COVID-19. The pandemic laid bare the chaos. Mask mandates became battlegrounds. Daily briefings morphed into soliloquies. He floated injecting disinfectant, downplayed deaths, blamed China, praised hydroxychloroquine, hosted crowded rallies as hospitals overflowed. He caught the virus, went to Walter Reed, was pumped full of experimental drugs, emerged triumphant, said, "Don't be afraid of COVID." Over 400,000 Americans died on his watch. Then came the 2020 election. He lost, but he didn't concede. He claimed fraud. No proof. Dozens of lawsuits, all failed, but the belief spread, the fire lit. On January 6th, 2021, his supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol. Confederate flags, riot gear, lawmakers evacuated, guns drawn inside the chamber. It was the first time the peaceful transfer of power failed to be peaceful, Trump watched from the White House. Delayed response, then told them, "We love you, you're very special." He was impeached. Again, the only president impeached twice. Acquitted. Again. He left office without attending the inauguration. No handshake, no note. Just Marine One lifting off into gray skies while Biden took the oath below. He didn't disappear. He never does. He launched a political comeback, filed lawsuits, held rallies, teased 2024, called the media the enemy, called prosecutors thugs, called himself your favorite president. His legacy remains a live wire, still sparking, still splitting rooms, still echoing through debates and dinner tables. For some, he was the man who finally told the truth. For others, he was the lie made flesh. And after him came the oldest man ever sworn into the presidency, a man forged in grief, softened by time, and determined to steady a ship that had been turned into a spectacle. His name was Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., and he entered office whispering what America hadn't heard in a while. Let's lower the temperature. Joe Biden. He arrived not with thunder, but with weariness. Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., the stuttering kid from Scranton turned senator at 29, vice president at 66, and finally, at 78, the oldest man ever sworn in as president of the United States. Didn't campaign as a savior, he campaigned as a sigh of relief. His pitch was simple: calm the chaos, close the Twitter tab, take the temperature down. After Trump's inferno of spectacle and sound, Biden offered room temperature, a promise to govern, not perform, to whisper, not scream, and that whisper came seasoned with grief. Biden's life reads like a ledger of personal loss. His wife and daughter killed in a car crash just after his first Senate win. His son, Beau, lost to brain cancer decades later. The heartbreak hung on him like a second suit. He carried it into every speech, every decision, every pause, between sentences that felt more like prayers than policy. He quoted poetry more than politicians. Seamus Heaney, Yeats, sometimes scripture, sometimes just silence. He called his presidency a battle for the soul of the nation. That phrase, which sounded quaint at first, quickly became literal. The country had seen insurrection, misinformation, a pandemic, rage. Biden stood before it all, blinking into the lights, and said, "We can do better." Then got to work. He signed the American Rescue Plan, a $1.9 trillion stimulus to cushion the pandemic's blow, extended unemployment, sent checks, boosted vaccinations. Critics said it was bloated. Supporters said it kept the lights on. He oversaw the largest vaccine rollout in history, over 200 million doses in his first months. He set targets, hit them, then the variants came. So did hesitancy. So did politics. Masks turned tribal. Boosters became battlegrounds. He pushed infrastructure. Real roads, real bridges, real broadband. A $1 trillion bill passed with bipartisan support. A word that had become mythological by then. He wore aviator sunglasses. Always had. Loved Amtrak. Rode it for decades. Knew conductors by name. His handlers used cue cards. His critics used clips. His stumbles, verbal, physical, became fuel for outrage machines. He called himself a union guy, told stories from the Senate, some true, some sentimental. He ended the war in Afghanistan. Abruptly, chaotically, the images shocked the world. Planes lifting off while desperate Afghans clung to landing gear. Marines killed in a suicide bombing. Allies left behind. The longest war ended not with closure, but with confusion. He took responsibility, sort of, said it was time, that the mission had changed, that America could no longer afford forever wars. He faced inflation, blamed global supply chains, corporate greed, the pandemic, Russia. Republicans blamed him. The grocery bills didn't care. He appointed the first black woman to the Supreme Court, Ketanji Brown Jackson. History made. Quietly, he forgave billions in student debt, then watched the courts tear it down. Tried again. Smaller. Slower. Still trying. He talked tough on climate, signed laws, pledged reductions, flew to conferences, posed with world leaders. The planet kept warming. He kept whispering. His approval ratings wavered, steady, then slipping, then steady again. He never lost his temper, just his place sometimes in the sentence. He walked like a man still healing, but he governed like a man who remembered what had already been lost. And in 2024, he prepared to run again, against the same man he beat in 2020. The rematch no one wanted, yet no one could stop. At his core, Joe Biden is a paradox, a career politician who survived by being underestimated, a man of empathy in an age of aggression, a president who believes decency is a strategy, and that whispering eventually might still be heard over the shouting, over